Chapter 16, Humans in Ponyville. **** the goddess ****. Once again, the humans attempted to open a gateway, and once again the goddess allowed it. Into the world her people had once called paradise came more machines, tearing into the soil and buzzing through the air of her former home. This, she also allowed. A single creature made its way through the gateway, prideful of precious information. This the goddess did not allow. She stretched forth her will and the infiltrator, the poor, butchered thing that it was caught. It struggled and writhed like a minnow in her hand. With a single ancient word, the goddess calmed it. With a delicate touch, she reached into it, and soon knew everything it did. Information flooded into her, filling in the blanks of what she knew of the worlds on the other side of the portal. Some of the information even managed to surprise her. This next part had to be done very delicately. The infiltrator's mind was first stripped bare, leaving it a blank slate. The goddess held the knowledge before her like a gigantic puzzle, turning it this way and that, considering it from every angle. And then she began to make changes. Everything provided by that so-called queen was removed and set aside. The caretaker would find no allies on the world known to the ponies as Equus. He wouldn't know that Equus even existed. Then she began to remove other information as well, with all the care and precision of a surgeon. When she was done, the goddess had two collections of pure information. The larger of the two she put aside for the moment. The smaller one was returned to the mind of the infiltrator, where it expanded to fill the empty space. And then the goddess began to speak more words of magic, invoking what little power she still had at her command, filling in the blank spaces in the information with carefully crafted half-truths and outright lies. The story that the goddess wove unfolded in the infiltrator's mind. It was a story of a race of inquisitive creatures driven by curiosity to explore. Gone was any mention of humanity's pony allies, as well as most of the information regarding their military capabilities. When the goddess finished weaving her tale, it created an image of a fairly harmless race of explorers who would find paradise fascinating, but who could be easily quelled should they attempt to invade. It amused her to no end that the one who had the audacity to give himself the name of caretaker had been so very careless. He thought her harmless, now, tamed and shackled by the massive shield that allowed only a trickle of her magic, processed and pacified, to reach the world below. Magic that was harnessed to maintain the machinery which upheld the mockery the caretaker declared to be existence. But even he couldn't change the fact that the veil between worlds was hers. Nothing passed through it without her approval. What she was doing now, allowing these humans to send their machines through, was a violation of what had once been some of her most basic guiding principles. She would never have allowed it, were it not for what the caretaker had done. That she had gone along willingly at first, even helping to create the shield that bound her. That was the part that had haunted her the most, all this time. The infiltrator was nearly ready to be released. The goddess studied it carefully, looking for flaws or inconsistencies in the information that it held. The caretaker knew she controlled the veil, but he couldn't be allowed to know how much she could influence what passed through it. If he discovered what she was doing, then the slow, careful work of uncounted ages would come undone in moments. But now that there was Earth and Equus, the trap was set and the final pieces were moving into place. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the goddess could see all the way to the end. Finally satisfied with her arrangements, she let the infiltrator slip away, watching as it slid back into the world she could no longer directly touch. The infiltrator swam through the air, unseen amongst the dreamers. Its destination was a single mountain, standing tall and lonely amongst the forests. It was far beneath this mountain that the caretaker had made his home. The infiltrator passed through the stone of the mountain as if it were fog. The goddess wasted no time. Speaking words of magic carefully yet quickly, she began creating a message, once again filled with half-truths and outright lies. A message designed to manipulate a creature she had never even met in a world she could only occasionally see. It didn't take long for the infiltrator to reappear, speeding through the air towards the still open gateway. The goddess had expected this. The caretaker was a cautious sort, and the small amount of information he had collected wouldn't be nearly enough. No doubt the infiltrator was instructed to range further this time, to gather as much data as possible even if that meant that it couldn't return quickly. As the infiltrator passed through the gateway, the goddess once again caught it. It amused her to note that its instructions had been changed exactly as she had hoped. The caretaker wouldn't be expecting his butchered abomination back anytime soon, which was all to the best. He would never see the infiltrator again. She worked quickly, uncertain of how much longer the humans would leave the gateway open. The infiltrator's mission parameters were changed, and the goddess message was implanted carefully. It now had only one purpose, hers. Once again, she released the infiltrator. It shot through the gate, single-minded and determined to fulfill her will. Blessings be on you, the goddess whispered. Forgive me for what I've done. All she could do now was wait. Wait for events to unfold, wait for the vessel that had been prepared for her. Soon, if fate was kind, she would walk her world again. Twilight ***. The sun was fading, and so was twilight. She put the book aside with a sigh and rubbed at her dry, tired eyes with her fetlock. So much information, and so little of it actually helpful in any way. She now knew more about the dream realms than most ponies alive, having read through nearly everything the royal library contained on the subject, and she still felt no closer to actually visiting the place than she had when she'd started. Each night Twilight had tried to reach the correct state of mind, and each night she failed. Trixie Lulamoon had achieved it on her very first try, which struck Twilight as monstrously unfair, but at least the other mare had been kind enough to give her a tip on how to get there herself. Twilight, it's time, Spike called from the far end of the apartment Twilight was staying in. Twilight sighed and placed the book on meditation techniques that she'd been reading back on the stack next to her. It was one she'd read already, but it had seemed the most logical and helpful of the bunch, so she had been skimming through it to see if she'd missed anything that could be helpful. Thanks, Spike, Twilight said. She got up and stretched, trying to work some of the kinks out of her back. The little dragon walked over and gathered up some of the books she'd just set aside, no doubt to put it away. On impulse, Twilight gathered him up in a hug and nuzzled him on the cheek. You've been such a great help to me this week. Ah, come on, Spike protested, blushing as he half-heartedly pushed her head away. No, I mean it, Twilight said as she let him go. I know I take you for granted sometimes, but you've really been a fantastic help. It really means a lot to me. PSSH, Spike waved dismissively as he looked away, but he wasn't able to hide his smile. Someone has to make sure you eat when you're on one of your study binges. And I appreciate it, Twilight said as she ruffled his spines. Spike batted her hoof away. Hey, I just got those straight. He re-straightened his spines. Ah, thanks, Twilight, but you'd better get going if you don't want to be late. You're right. See you later, Spike. Twilight gave him another quick hug before walking out the door. The chamber where the potential Dream Guard were meeting was a quick trot away. Twilight arrived and took her usual place on a cushion that was somewhat secluded from the others. Several of the candidates were already there, chatting amongst themselves. A quick glance showed her that Trixie wasn't there, which was a pity. Twilight had been hoping to get a few last-minute pointers from the mayor before trying again tonight. A few minutes after the last of the candidates had settled, Princess Luna entered. She swept gracefully through the room and settled onto a divan. Folding her wings across her sides, the princess looked around the room and smiled. Begin, she said. Twilight took a deep breath, then slowly let it out. It was time to try again, but she wasn't too optimistic. Having musicians in the room hadn't worked, and the incense had made her sneeze. Exercise before meditation had just made her sweaty and uncomfortable. Twilight had tried everything that both she and Luna could think of before Trixie had suggested multiplication tables. Twilight decided that it was worth a try, even if it seemed counterintuitive. She worked her way quickly through the single digits, then began multiplying double digits together. After a few minutes, she lost herself in the process, running almost on automatic. The numbers, beautiful and perfect and wonderfully predictable, danced in her head. She reached the point where she was multiplying triple digits against double digits when some pony talking nearby shook her out of her relaxed state of mind. Twilight opened her eyes to scold whoever it was. The first thing she saw was Princess Luna. She was talking softly to Trixie and a tiny mare that she recognized as another Dream Guard candidate. The very next thing she noticed was that each of them seemed to be hovering in a featureless grey void that stretched out to infinity. Princess, Twilight said tentatively, getting the attention of all three of the others. The tiny mare looked away shyly while Trixie gaped at her incredulously. Princess Luna, however, simply smiled warmly. Twilight, I'm so glad you finally made it. I did. It had been a goal fraught with mounting frustration for over a week. To have made it so unexpectedly, Twilight couldn't believe it at first, but a quick check around the featureless void she found herself in was enough to tell her that her environment matched all descriptions she'd read of the threshold. I did. Relief flooded her only to be quickly displaced by joy. She turned to Trixie, who was still gaping at her. Oh, Trixie, thank you. I never would have made it here if it hadn't been for your advice. The resultant extremely loud and unexpected scream from the other mare jolted Twilight out of the mental state she'd finally managed to achieve. She blinked, disoriented at finding herself still sitting on her cushion. What the heck was that about? She muttered to herself. Tilde tilde asterisk Erin asterisk tilde tilde. The Sunday sun had just crested the eastern horizon when the specially commissioned train pulled into Ponyville. Almost nobody in town was awake yet, which suited Erin just fine. She took a moment to straighten her yellow sundress before going back to shifting nervously from hoof to hoof. When the doors finally opened, she let out a little involuntary yelp of excitement. The first person out of the passenger car was an older man, probably in his late 50s. His bald head gleamed in the early sunlight, and he had a scruffy grey beard on his narrow face. He honestly looked a slightly villainous, but when he broke into an impish smile Erin began to relax. Miss Sunflower, I presume, the man said, approaching with his hand stretched out. Erin giggled and held out a hoof, which he shook. I'm Jerry Mallon. I'm the head of this little gang of interdimensional explorers. Yup, I'm Sunflower, Erin said. You can call me Erin if you like, it doesn't matter to me. How was the trip? Hectic at first. The ponies shuffled us through the palace and onto a train before we could even blink. Though, they were nice enough to carry all of our gear for us. He clapped his hands. Oh, that reminds me. A few of these boxes are for you. Maggie Henson asked us to deliver them for you. Awesome. That's got to be all the stuff I ordered. Erin's grin melted into a concerned frown. At least I hope that's all of it. It makes a stack as high as I am tall, Jerry said, eyes twinkling. I have to admit, I'm curious as to what all that is. Erin winked. It's a surprise for the ponies. While the two of them had been talking, several men and a few women exited the train. They were busy looking around, whispering animatedly to each other while pointing out various buildings and landmarks. Jerry saw her looking and chuckled. I suppose I should introduce the gang, he said, then whistled sharply to get everyone's attention. Over here, guys. Erin looked them over as they approached. For the most part, they looked to be late 20s to early 30s, though a couple of them ranged into their 40s or older. They all wore comfortable, casual clothes that would probably have Rarity wringing her hooves in disappointment, but which Applejack would probably approve of as sensible enough for a hard day of work. Jerry ran through the names far too quickly for Erin to remember. Only a few of them stuck in her head during that first introduction. There were two men named Rob, who were introduced as Rob 1 and Rob 2. Of the three women, one had the unusual name of Tandy. The last name Erin remembered from the flurry of introductions was a man who looked to be a few years older than she was. Lucas Vasquez had short black hair, meltingly dark brown eyes and a confident grin that had Erin's own smile turning a little goofy before she noticed what she was doing and clamped down on it. There was no way she was going to remember all of the names. Fortunately, they were all wearing name tags, so she wouldn't be too lost. Which raised an interesting question. So, why the name tags? Erin asked, pointing to the one Jerry was wearing. Jerry adjusted his tag and gave it a little buff with the collar of his shirt. Before we came over, we were given this big speech about how we're all representatives of humanity, and all that. We're supposed to be nice, friendly and approachable. We're also supposed to be on our best behavior. He looked at the group of assembled humanity out of the corner of his eye. Isn't that right, gang? The group responded with reasonably eager assertions that this was, in fact, the case. Well, that's good, Erin said. If she were to be honest, it was something she'd been a little concerned about. So, I think we should get you guys settled, huh? Sounds good, Jerry replied with a nod. He turned to the group of humans and began issuing orders. Soon enough, all of the gear and luggage was brought out and stacked onto the carts that they had also brought along. It was quite the parade that Erin led through town. First to the Moondrop Inn, where she'd reserved rooms for all of them. Unfortunately there had only been 4 rooms available, so they would have to pack 2 or 3 to a room. Not a problem, Jerry said when she told him that. We expected a little bit of hardship. After the gear had been stored, Erin guided the group to her home, where they dropped off her new purchases off in her living room. The Ponyville Town Hall was their next stop. Along the way, Erin pointed out various interesting shops as well as some of her favorite places to eat. The occasional pony who was awake early enough all had the same basic reaction, stopping and staring in amazed bewilderment at the troop of humans marching through their small town. Mare was waiting for them, adjusting her collar and smiling professionally as the group approached. Erin and the other humans stopped a short distance away. Welcome, everyone, the mayor said. Welcome to Ponyville. ** Pinkie Pie ** The start of the day for a baker was different than the start of the day for most ponies. The sky was dark when the cakes got out of bed for work, and it was still dark by the time the first of the new bread was coming out of the ovens. Granted, as an apprentice baker, Pinkie didn't have to work that early most days. Though, she tried to get up early anyway in order to help the cakes with the twins, even on her days off. The cakes weren't so lucky. Every day for them was long and tiring. Pinkie knew in her heart that the only thing that kept the 2 of them going was the sincere love they had for their jobs and their even deeper love for each other. Pinkie's usual job in the morning was to assist with the baking and to clean the shelves. The second part was one of her most favorite jobs ever, as cleaning the shelves often meant she got to gobble down the rare unsold pastry. The cakes had heard of other bakeries selling day-old wares, but they wanted no part of it. It was fresh or nothing at Sugarcube Corner. Thus it was that she took care of her chores and her breakfast simultaneously, which was the best way to work as far as Pinkie Pie was concerned. Today was one of those days that Pinkie had agreed to work in the morning. Not that she minded. After her initial frenzy of cleaning, the cakes would usually put her on the register. That meant that she got to greet every pony who came in. Not to mention every donkey, cow, mule and, just recently, human. Pinkie was nudged from her reverie by a pair of voices from a nearby table, one of them mentioning humans. She looked over to see Daisy and Lily enjoying a snack. Since there were no customers in line, Pinkie took the moment to nonchalantly sidle over for a little eavesdropping. They wanted to put one of those things on my shop, Lily was saying, as if I'd let them do that. She scoffed and added, I sent them on their way, of course. I let them do it, Daisy said, which caused Lily to sputter a little. Why would you do that? Good question, Pinkie exclaimed, momentarily forgetting that eavesdroppers aren't supposed to participate in the conversations they listen in on. The 2 startled mares turned to look at her. Pinkie smiled and slowly backed away to find a new place where she could be unobtrusive while still being close enough to listen in as their conversation started back up. Ah, because they'll be paying a monthly fee of 20 bits to any pony who lets them set one up, Daisy replied after a few seconds. She rolled her eyes. I mean, business is good, but extra bits for doing nothing is always nice. Though, I guess it will be using some of my electricity. Lily's mouth had been hanging open all through Daisy's explanation. She shut it with a snap. Nobody told me they were offering money for that. And how long did you let them talk before you slammed the door in their face? Daisy asked, grinning. Lily's face turned lemon sour. Okay, point taken. But what do those things even do? I don't want some weird bit of human stuff hanging off of my shop, especially when it's also my home. Daisy shrugged and sipped her coffee. I think the one in charge said it was a wireless network. I guess it works a little like a radio. Wait. Lily waved a hoof, frowning. You mean, it's just for human radio broadcasts? I guess so. Daisy shrugged again. I don't really know, but it seems likely. A pony named Radio Wave was with them. I guess he's from Manhattan, where he works on radio towers. Lily perked up at that. Oh, is he cute? Daisy giggled at that. Pinkie, who was busily pretending to clean a non-existent dirty spot from a nearby countertop, didn't bother correcting their misunderstanding about the wireless network. This was partially because she didn't want them to know she'd still been listening, but mostly because she had no idea how to explain what it really was. Some customers came in then, and Pinkie had to stop her eavesdropping so she could take their order. By the time she'd gotten them their food, Daisy and Lily had finished up and were already halfway out the door. With a sigh, Pinkie got back to her chores. The humans sure had stirred things up, Pinkie reflected. Pinkie stopped mid-chore, tilting her head as a thought struck her. Ponies had herds. A group of bears, she knew, was called a sleuth, and beavers had colonies. Birds had flocks and wolves had packs. And, of course, every pony knew that a group of alligators was called a congregation. But she had no idea what a group of humans was called. Pinkie made a mental note to ask Sunflower when she saw her next. This led her to think over her plans for the party she was going to throw for the humans before they left. And time, like it sometimes did, played that game where it suddenly went by much too fast, and before Pinkie even knew it was lunchtime, there was Mr. Cake tapping her on the shoulder. There was probably some calculation that explained how quickly time flew when you were having fun, and by what amount. There was probably some complicated mathematical equation that would allow a pony to figure out exactly how much fun you were having by how quickly time passed, and vice versa. Twilight would probably know, but she was still in Canterlot learning how to be a dream poker, though her latest letter said she'd be coming back tomorrow. Pinkie realized that she was forgetting something. A second nudge on her shoulder reminded her what it was. Yes, Miss Cake, Pinkie asked, blinking up at the older mare. Time for your lunch, dearie. You can take the rest of the afternoon off, the mare replied with a very special smile. It was one that most ponies had, a smile that showed how much you cared for the pony you were talking to. Miss Cake had gotten really good at that one now that she was a mom. Pinkie smiled back, trying her best to match Miss Cake's. And, since she loved Miss Cake very, very much, it was pretty darn close. Okie dokie, I'm gonna go get Mr. Hugglebunny and head out. Miss Cake's smile became a little stiff. If Pinkie hadn't known better, she'd have sworn that the older mare was maybe just a bit creeped out by her new friend. Okay, Pinkie, you have fun. Mr. Hugglebunny was on his nightstand, looking especially dapper in his new clothes. Rarity had taken one look at Pinkie's amateur sewing job, which had the tablet nearly falling out of the front of Mr. Hugglebunny's overalls, and had immediately insisted on fitting the stuffed rabbit with a new pair out of dark blue denim. Now the tablet was nice and snug, all cuddled up on the plush bunny's tummy, the wire for his charger exiting out of one of his pockets. Pinky poked him, whispered, "Time to get up," in his ear and unplugged him. She put him on her back, went downstairs, and was soon out in the clear afternoon sun of Ponyville. The market was bustling, though not as much as usual. Many ponies had filled up their houses with food the previous week, when the papers had convinced them that a massive wave of changelings was about to conquer all of Equestria. When that turned out not to happen, there were quite a few ponies trying to hide their embarrassment about having filled up their spare rooms with as much food as they could get their hooves on. It had been good for the market ponies and farmers, though. Still, there were plenty of ponies shopping, and Pinky was wearing herself out waving to all of her friends who, of course, was every pony. Mr. Hugglebunny got a few odd looks, but then, he usually did. Pinky was a mare with a mission, today. 2 days ago, she found out that Sunflower was coming back from Sweet Apple Acres and spending the afternoons in the movie theater, which was suddenly and mysteriously closed for business. When Pinky had asked her about it, Sunflower had simply winked and said, "It's a surprise." Pinky loved surprises, usually. But that was only for surprises that were actually a surprise. To know about a surprise but having to wait for days and days to find out what it actually was made Pinky's brain itch. She just had to know. And, so, today was the day for finding Sunflower, turning on the puppy dog eyes, and pestering her until she spilled the secret. It was the only tactic Pinky had left. Nothing else had worked, not even a box of freshly baked snickerdoodles. "I wonder if Sunflower is done with her work at Sweet Apple Acres," Pinky asked Mr. Hugglebunny. "If she did, then she's probably at her house. Oh, I hope she's learning all sorts of cool Earth pony stuff out there. I wonder if I should teach her some of my own tricks." Slumped lazily across her back, Mr. Hugglebunny's silence spoke volumes. Pinky sighed. "Yeah, you're right," she said. "I'd better let her get the basic stuff down first. Thanks, Mr. Hugglebunny." The rabbit on her back made that bing sound that let her know that he had been listening. After a few seconds, his somber voice said, "I'm sorry, Pinkie Pie. I didn't quite catch that." "Oh, don't worry about it," Pinky said. She continued on her way at a steady walk. She would have tried her usual pronking, but Mr. Hugglebunny didn't have the best grip strength in his plush little paws. She found Sunflower standing outside of her house for some reason. The mare was across the street, standing in the shade of a tree, staring up at her roof with her eyes half-lidded. The weird little smile on her face looked a little like the one a pony got when they were looking at the last cupcake in a box and nobody else was around to take it first. When Pinky got closer, she noticed that her friend was humming a tuneless little song. Pinky sidled up next to Sunflower and looked where she was looking. There were several humans up on the roof and, as far as Pinky could tell, all of them were male. A couple of them weren't wearing shirts, which Pinky found strange. She'd never seen a half-clothed human before, but Sunflower had grown up seeing humans, so that couldn't be what she was so interested in. Pinky decided to ask her. "What you're looking at?" Pinky asked brightly. "Gah." Sunflower replied, jumping in place. She blinked, and then she said, "Pinky. Yup, you startled me." "I wasn't trying to." Pinky tilted her head at her. "You didn't notice me walk up next to you." Sunflower blinked a couple more times, then cleared her throat and looked away while she scuffed the ground with a hoof. "Ah, no." "Oh." Pinky considered that for a moment, then shrugged. "It probably wasn't important. So, what were you looking at?" "Nothing." Sunflower yelped. Then she cleared her throat. "Nothing. I was just, trying to figure out how much work was left on the solar tiles." Pinky used her own peepers to ponder the problem. "Looks like they're a little over halfway, Sunflower," she said. "That means they'll be done by this weekend, probably, right?" Sunflower sighed. "Yeah, I suppose so." She glanced up at the shirtless humans on the roof and muttered, "It was fun while it lasted, I guess." Pinky frowned as she looked at the humans. Sunflower had said, "Fun." Something about the other humans being here was fun. Something about them leaving made Sunflower a little sad. She watched as one of the humans, a darker-skinned one Pinky knew as Lucas, stretched his arms over his head then rubbed a shoulder. He certainly had some clearly defined muscles and a distressing lack of body fat, she noted. Next to her, Sunflower let out a little sigh. Gears turned in Pinky's head and eventually it clicked. She had just figured out why Sunflower was sad. Oh, why couldn't she have figured it out before? On impulse, she hugged her friend, who turned to her with a confused expression. "I know what's bothering you," Pinky said. Sunflower's eyes got really big for half a second, so Pinky hurried to add, "Maybe we can invite some of the humans to stay here, so you don't have to be the only human in Ponyville. What do you think?" Sunflower looked confused for a second, then smiled. "Not a half-bad idea, Pinky, but I don't think these particular ones will want to stay." Pinky's ears drooped. "Oh, well, maybe some new humans will show up and want to stay. You can have all sorts of human friends, so you won't be lonely." The smile that broke out on Sunflower's face warmed Pinky's heart. It didn't hurt that she also found herself on the receiving end of a fierce hug from the other mare. "I'm never lonely in Ponyville, Pinky," Sunflower said. "How can I be? You live here." Pinky's heart swelled with joy and her smile got so wide her face could barely hold it all. "So, anyway," Sunflower said, "I've been thinking about that surprise, and I decided I'd show you as long as you promise not to tell anybody else." Pinky, who by this point had forgotten all about her super important mission, gaped at the other mare for a moment. Then she let out an ear-sundering shriek of pure joy and jumped in the air, doing a double backflip before landing back on her hooves. "You will." Sunflower glanced at her own back, where Mr. Hugglebunny had landed during Pinky's sudden outbreak of gymnastics. "Yeah, sure." "Hooray," Pinky cheered. And then, just to show she really meant it, she did a cartwheel. Sunflower giggled. "As a reward, I will allow you to carry Mr. Hugglebunny," Pinky said. "Oh, I couldn't." Pinky put on her serious face. "I have another reason," she said in her serious voice. "What's that?" "I feel the need to do a lot of bouncing, and he can't hold on all that well." Sunflower chuckled. "Got it." The two of them made their way to the movie theater, with Sunflower walking and Pinkie Pie pronking along joyfully. They didn't talk much, though that might have been because Pinky was humming a cheerful little ditty to herself. It was a song she'd been working on for a while, but she didn't have all the words to yet. When they reached the Ponyville Theater, Sunflower knocked. After a minute, the dark gray stallion who owned the place opened the door. "Hi, Mr. Lantern," Pinky said, waving. The other pony broke into a wide grin. "Hello, Pinky," Shadow Lantern replied in his Trottingham accent. "And, Miss Sunflower, was hoppin' you'd be back today." "I was. The electrician pulled an all-nighter, and the work ponies got everything else set up this morning, sweet as popcorn. I was just about to fire it up for a test. You can be my first audience." "That's great." Sunflower tipped Pinky a wink as they followed the stallion inside. "You're gonna love this." Sunflower led her to the theater's seats, where she sat down and faced the screen. Mr. Hugglebunny got his own seat on Sunflower's left side. Pinky didn't join him at first, instead looking around and trying to figure out where the surprise was. Sunflower nudged her in the ribs. "Pinky, sit down." "But what's the surprise?" Sunflower rolled her eyes and patted the seat next to her. "You're about to see it." It clicked, and Pinky felt a little slow for not realizing earlier. "You brought a human movie." Sunflower snickered at that. "Not exactly." The lights went out. There was a click, a hum, and then music. A sepia-toned lion inside a circle with writing on it showed up on the movie screen. The lion roared, but without any of the flickering images or fuzzy sound that Pinky was used to when watching a movie. In fact, this image looked almost as clear as the screen that Sunflower had given to them to watch movies on. As the lion roared, Sunflower leaned over and whispered, "I brought a whole bunch of movies, and a digital projector with wireless remote speakers, too." The lion faded away, and the title screen came on. "The Wizard of Oz," Pinky read aloud. "I figured this would be a good movie to show every pony on the first human movie day," Sunflower said. Pinky, overcome with emotion, smiled at her friend and then gathered her up in a big hug. "Oh, I love you so much, Sunflower." Giggling, Sunflower hugged Pinky back before giving her a little push. "Oh, just watch the movie, you silly filly." Pinky did so. After a few minutes, she asked, "So, I'm guessing the cow doesn't have any lines." Sunflower just laughed. Changeling ***. The changeling sat up expectantly in its tiny cell. Someone was coming, someone with an aura both sharp and somehow warm. Someone who, unlike the guards it could sense on the other side of the thick steel door, actually wanted to be here. It was a familiar aura, one the changeling was surprised to find that it was eager to be near again. The door opened, allowing the human named Raka into the cell. She looked around with a disdainful sniff. "I see they've at least brought in some furnishings," she said. It was true. The bench that had been the only furniture had been replaced with a low couch. There was also the addition of several cushions on the floor, big enough for the changeling to curl up and sleep in. The guard who had dropped them off had mentioned that they were dog beds. He had seemed oddly disappointed when the changeling had simply thanked him for them. They were oddly comfortable. The red one was its favorite. "Yes," the changeling said. It hopped off the bench and gestured towards it with one whole riddled hoof. "Please, make yourself comfortable." "Are you sure?" The changeling nodded. "I'm just as comfortable on the floor as I am on the bench," it said. "Well, thank you." Raka sat down. Then she regarded the changeling curiously for a few minutes. "So, can we pick up where we left off yesterday?" "If you wish," the changeling said. Answering a few questions in return for being treated well seemed a fair trade, after all. "First things first, though. I can't keep calling you changeling, so I decided to give you a name." The changeling blinked. "Why, I told you about my designation, didn't I?" "You did, but it's a mouthful. Having a simple name to call you by is just easier." The changeling considered this, then nodded. "I have no objections. If anything, I'm curious as to what you would name me." "Well, I have a few ideas. My first one is Riddle." "Riddle," the changeling repeated. "Interesting choice. Why?" "Well, I'm trying to figure out more about you." Raka smiled and spread her hands out before her in a gesture that the changeling recognized as a shrug. "It seemed appropriate, I guess." "Riddle," the changeling repeated. It thought about it for a long moment. "I find this acceptable. I'm Riddle." Raka snorted and shot him a bemused smile. "Don't you want to hear my other choices?" Riddle shook its head. "No need. I like Riddle." It smiled. "Besides, I think I like it better than Puzzle, or Conundrum, and those seem to be obvious second choices." Warm laughter filled the room, and Riddle felt something completely unexpected from the human. A burst of warmth, a trickle of affection. It had been days since Riddle had last fed on any kind of love, and in its surprise, it almost missed its chance. The warm light from the human was small and nowhere near sufficient to sate its hunger, but it was still very welcome. Riddle realized that there was now a chance for survival. Somehow, this Raka cared for it, even if just a little bit, without it being disguised as some pony else. Optimism wasn't a very familiar concept to changelings, but Riddle was finding the experience enjoyable. "So, what else do you want to know?" Riddle asked. "We were going to discuss the various levels of changelings in a hive yesterday," Raka said as she flipped through a notebook. "You mentioned something about changelings being able to go up levels." "Except for workers, yes," Riddle replied. "Soldiers, like myself, can be, well, promoted, I guess. For each promotion, the changeling will be fed an overabundance of love nectar, which will allow him to grow larger, stronger, and smarter. When one reaches the rank of captain, part of the change is that they may choose a gender, and even reproduce." "So, you're currently asexual?" Raka asked as she scribbled in her notebook. "Yes," Riddle said, "though, I was speculating towards female, should I ever make it that far." It grimaced. "I won't have that option, now. I will be a soldier for the rest of my life." "Oh, never say never," Raka replied absent-mindedly, still taking notes. Riddle blinked at her, waiting for her to catch up and ask another question. "Why female?" Raka asked eventually. "Most soldiers are inclined towards females," came Riddle's prompt reply. "Since none but generals, nymphs, and chrysalis herself can produce soldiers, captains and higher are needed to maintain a supply of worker drones. That can be more easily accomplished with a larger number of females." Raka grimaced at that. When Riddle had explained about the workers, she'd shown some distaste towards the idea of an entire class of changelings, smaller and weaker than the others and barely sapient, whose only duty was to do the dirty work of the hive. "Such a structured life, where even your breeding is so regulated," Raka said. "I'm frankly amazed that you are so willingly giving us so much information." Doesn't it bother you that we might be able to use this information against your queen? Not my queen any longer, Riddle said. Should she ever find my mind again, she will crush it. She has to know that I won't be subject to her will over here, and since I'm captured. Well, she doesn't have the same option as she does for other changeling prisoners. Which is misinformation, Riddle said. Ordinarily, you can do whatever you like to a changeling prisoner. You can beat them, abuse them, any torture at all, and yet they'll only tell you exactly what Chrysalis wants. It's a wonderful way to spread lies amongst the enemy, and the queen has never been one to turn down an advantage. Raka frowned at Riddle, and then at her notebook. How can I trust what you're telling me now, then? The gate is closed. I'm not being controlled by Chrysalis right now. That doesn't mean you're automatically telling the truth, Raka pointed out. Riddle considered this for a long moment, then shrugged. I guess you have no way of knowing. I may be lying right now, though I have no reason to do so. For all you know, everything out of my mouth has been a lie. Suspicion grew in the human, tainting the room with a sour, acidic tang. So why should I believe you're telling the truth? I have no reason not to, and my survival depends on your goodwill, Riddle replied with a shrug. I've been telling you the truth this whole time. After all, the queen isn't in my head, forcing my mouth shut while you burn me and pluck out my eyes, allowing me to speak only when my torturers are convinced I'm thoroughly broken, and thus accepting the lies she feeds me as the absolute truth. Nausea replaced the suspiciousness that clouded the air between Raka and Riddle. You say that as if it's happened before, she said. Oh, it has. To another soldier of the generation before mine, who was disguised as a merchant's guard pony and captured by a band of griffin bandits. The information that Chrysalis gave them prompted them to move their territory several miles further south, which shifted trade routes as merchants moved to avoid their new territory. Thus bringing those merchants closer to our hive, which made it much easier for our soldiers to replace them. Riddle shrugged. Naturally, other changelings disguised as guards showed up to disperse the bandits before they could follow through on their plans of eating the prisoner. Our disguises fail when we die. It would have ruined the plan. Well, at least they rescued it, Raka muttered. Riddle tilted its head. Rescue? No, of course not. What use is a crippled soldier that will never recover? Outrage joined the nausea that filled the room, tainting the air in reds and oranges. They killed it, Raka said. Riddle shrugged. You've asked before why I don't feel what you call loyalty for the queen. I think I know why, now, Raka said, looking away. Riddle looked at her, considering how much further these emotions could be pushed. Sympathy often led to affection, it knew, but too much horror might drive Raka away, and humans were an unknown quantity. Do you know how many changelings died when we tried to take Canterlot? Riddle asked eventually. Raka blinked and her brows lowered before she replied. Her confusion tinged the air. No, I don't. Neither do I, neither did Chrysalis. We're all replaceable to her, so she never bothered counting. She just ordered her generals and daughters to begin producing replacements. Her defeat was far more important than our deaths, which was an inconvenience, but hardly tragic. All I know was how empty the hive felt. And so many wounded. Those unable to recover were no longer useful, of course, so the number of wounded dropped off quite rapidly. Raka looked away. Riddle watched silently, paying close attention to the emotions she was emitting. Finally the human cleared her throat. I think I have enough for now. Riddle nodded. It waited a few seconds while Raka turned and walked towards the door. Just before she knocked, it called out. Raka. Raka, her hand raised to knock, turned and looked back. Yes. Thank you for my new name, Riddle replied. I like it very much. Raka offered up a wavering smile, then rapped on the metal door. After she'd left, Riddle curled up in its red doggy bed, nose to tail, and considered the future. Raka would no doubt process all of what had been said. On her return, she would be so full of sympathy that she would almost subconsciously begin emitting more affection. Perhaps even enough to sustain Riddle for the foreseeable future. Chrysalis ***. If it were to be mapped, the hive of the changelings would look a little like an enormous cone. The bulk of it was underground, with a few disguised openings in the dry, hilly countryside that made up the area the ponies called the Badlands. The higher up one was, the higher in rank they were. Generals and the 6 princess nymphs lived on the top layer, with hugely opulent chambers. Officers made up the second level. Their chambers were much more Spartan, but they didn't have to share. One level further down was where the common soldiery lived, huddled together in large rooms when they slept. Workers had no need for sleep, so they had no rooms of their own. Instead, they simply worked until they died. Various chambers were below the soldiers, some for growing the fungi that made up the bulk of the changelings' physical diet and others for the prisoners that fed them emotionally. Further down were the hatcheries, as well as large rooms for storage and for training. There was even a library, one that rivaled the royal library in Canterlot. It was in this library that Chrysalis found herself. She had an ancient tome suspended in her magical field, open to a particular page. The header of the page read, The Last Prophecy of Queen Morphia, and it contained a prophecy that was over 1,000 years old. It had come to Queen Morphia in a vision during Nightmare Moon's first attempt at bringing an eternal night. The old queen had been planning her next move, now that Equestria was short one princess. Then the fit came over her and she had dropped to the ground, limbs quaking and jittering, as she shrieked out this prophecy. Queen Chrysalis read the words once again, though she'd long since memorized them. To a world unknown, a single deceiver journeys cast into the uncharted land, an alliance forged. Capture control of the sun and moon. Canterlot broken, cast down from the mountain. The changeling shall rise, the one true queen shall rule the changelings forevermore. This wasn't the first prophecy Queen Morphia had produced, but it was the one that had cost her the most physically. By the time she was done with the recitation, she was barely able to resist as her daughters devoured her. 3 days later, once the fighting between them had ended with the deaths of all but one nymph, the newly ascended Queen Ethereal had risen to the throne. Chrysalis snorted, a wry smile etching across her features. She had first encountered this prophecy while still a nymph herself, barely hatched and competing with her sisters for favor and advantage in the court of Queen Phantasm. From the moment she had first seen it, she had been determined to be the one true queen that the prophecy foretold. It was a misinterpretation of this prophecy that had led her to her ill-fated attempt to conquer Canterlot. A single deceiver had certainly meant a lone changeling. After planning for years, she had come to the conclusion that the world unknown meant Canterlot, and uncharted land could mean marriage, for no queen of the hive ever married. The alliance forged would then obviously mean her subjugated husband and whatever resources he would bring to her cause. Wishful thinking, she knew now. Still, when she had managed to bring down Celestia, she had taken that as proof that she had been right all along. But now she knew she had it right. Sending a single changeling to Earth had been something of a whim, prompted solely by the first 2 lines of the prophecy. After her disappointing attempt to conquer Equestria, she hadn't expected very much from her new, single deceiver. But now, an alliance was on the horizon. An alliance with a creature of unknown power. Chrysalis eyed the soldier that stood unmoving next to her. With Chrysali's own power suppressing the changeling's mind, the infiltrator had taken it over quite easily. Its movements were still somewhat awkward but were improving at an impressive rate. The gift of the soldier was both an attempt to curry favor with her strange new allies and a means to facilitate communication. Already, that gift was bearing fruit. The infiltrator was an expert in strange magics completely unknown to the changelings, and had been teaching the changeling elite. The first spell it had shared had been a counter to the changeling detection spells the ponies were using. It made the changeling casting it so unremarkable, so unnoticeable, that it would most likely be ignored by even the most attentive guards. The applications of such a spell were numerous, the implications staggering. Chrysalis held up the book near her right shoulder, where the infiltrator could see it. Does this mean anything to you? The infiltrator glanced at the page. Yes, it said. This is part of a larger prophecy. It speaks of the liberation of our world. From the humans? Chrysalis asked. The infiltrator didn't answer. It did that sometimes. Chrysalis scowled. You promised assistance, correct? Correct. What is the rest of your prophecy? Chrysalis already had a quill and scroll held in her magic, and she wrote quickly as the infiltrator relayed the rest of the prophecy. Dreamers in the maelstrom, the chaos breaks, the crystal chains magic flows, the mountain torn asunder, the lost are found, the deceiver grows powerful, a goddess will arise to break time's hold. Quote. Queen Chrysali's eyes gleamed with greed. A goddess, she repeated, then licked her lips. I like the sound of that. She eyed the infiltrator. Am I to be that goddess? The infiltrator took a moment to answer. It is a possible outcome. Chrysalis could have danced with glee. This caretaker of yours, I assume he knows all this. Again, there was the moment of hesitation. The caretaker will serve the goddess when she walks the lands of paradise. Joyful laughter rebounded off the walls of the changeling's library. Chrysalis did dance, then, spinning in a graceful circle. I'm to be a goddess of 2 worlds, she cried as she came to a halt. 3, if I can bring the humans in line. Wouldn't that be wonderful? The infiltrator didn't answer. This time, Chrysalis didn't notice the silence, caught up as she was in her dreams. Eventually, she calmed. Now was a time for planning. She made her way to the Queen's council chamber, sending a mental command to summon her daughters and her generals as she did so. Though communication could take place over any distance, Chrysalis still preferred to be face-to-face with those under her direct command. She liked to see them obeying her. They were all there by the time she arrived. Dozens of glowing azure eyes turned to her as she swept her way to her throne. My children, Chrysalis intoned, we have plans to make. A time of great change is upon us, one that will see the changeling race change forever. She turned to the infiltrator. What are your thoughts on how to begin? The infiltrator didn't respond for a few seconds. When its answer finally came, every changeling in the room heard it. First, you must capture those who can control the sun and moon. Quote. Chapter 17, Dreams, Prophecies and Portents. Celestia**. Celestia awoke, feeling crowded by a sense of dread that compressed her chest, making her breathe in short gasps. Her eyes flicked around her bedroom. Nothing was out of place, nothing seemed threatening, and yet that sense of danger, of wrongness, still loomed over her. Something terrible is going to happen. There was no point in trying to go back to sleep, she knew. Far better for her to get an early start on her day. A quick shower was in order, and perhaps some calming tea. Her horn glowed, removing her blankets as she rose. Celestia set her hooves onto the soft rug that muffled the chill of the stone floor. She turned and froze, her breath catching in her throat. There was something unfamiliar in her room. The figure was shrouded in shadow, a blur in the darkness. It was hunched over, head towards the floor. Celestia lit her horn, bathing the room in a soft golden glow, which served to illuminate the figure before her while somehow making the remaining shadows starker, sharper than before. A pony stood in her room, one who was unfamiliar at first. On either side, wings drooped towards the floor, and Celestia first thought it was a Pegasus. Then Celestia saw the horn and knew who this pony was. Erin. Celestia's fear began to drain away, though the sense of dread remained. Something about Erin's posture was wrong, unnatural. Her front legs were splayed wide, and her head dangled limply between her knees. A muttering filled the air, and Celestia realized that Erin was speaking, her voice low and all the words crowding together. Prisoner, Erin was muttering, her head still hanging towards the floor. Break the mountain. 2. Become free. Quote. Erin. Celestia took a cautious step forward. However it was that Erin had been able to enter her bedchambers could be addressed later. Right now, the mare needed assistance. Erin, can you hear me? Are you all right? The muttering continued, becoming louder. Celestia could make out more of it, now, though what she heard didn't fill her with comfort. Free the prisoner in stone. Break the mountain, free the dream. 2. Separate, will become free, broken. Erin, please look at me, Celestia said, taking another step forward. The muttering cut off. Erin's ears flicked madly, as if swarmed by flies. Then her head snapped upright so abruptly that Celestia took a startled step back. The features were familiar, the same tumble of auburn mane, the same sandy coat. But her eyes were deep black pools that seemed to trap any light that came near her. An expression of overwhelming sorrow was on her features, made horrible by the black pits of her eyes. Canterlot will fall, the thing that looked like Erin rasped. Free the prisoner, or chaos will reign forever. There was a sound like the crack of thunder as Celestia's forehoof struck the stone of her bedroom. What are you? She demanded. Where is Erin? The future will break you if you remain alone, Dawnbringer, the Erin thing cried. Free the prisoner. Free the prisoner. What prisoner? I don't understand. A loud cry shook Celestia's world. At first, she thought it was coming from the thing that looked like Erin. Then a pair of tiny hooves impacted on her ribcage, and her eyes snapped open. She was lying in her bed, breathing heavily. Her blankets were tangled amongst her sweat-soaked limbs, and Prince Verdant was pushing urgently on her chest with his little green hooves. Wake up, wake up, wake up, the little prince was saying, his voice insistent and urgent. It took a moment for Celestia to take it all in. What she knew now as a dream was slowly fading, but it left behind that sense of wrongness, that feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Prince Verdant was crying, his face clenched in a mask of desperation. He pushed frantically with his hooves, and Celestia raised her head to nuzzle him. It's all right, dear, I'm awake, I'm awake. She rearranged herself, and the little colt curled up like a kitten in between her forelegs. Did you have a bad dream, little one? He didn't reply, but she could feel Verdant's nod against her chest. She stroked his mane with a hoof. Don't worry, it was just a dream, Celestia said, even as the remains of her own were refusing to fade completely. Your Aunt Luna would protect you from any really bad dreams. Prince Verdant didn't say anything, but his breathing settled down. Celestia was certain he'd fallen asleep when he spoke suddenly. Free the prisoner, he mumbled. A shard of ice formed in Celestia's chest even as the little colt finally drifted back to sleep. Tilde tilde asterisk Erin asterisk tilde tilde. Erin was once again galloping through a dark and threatening forest on cracked, bloody hooves. The bushes and brambles growing all around clawed at her mane and tail and left scratches across her coat as she pushed through them. All the while, a menacing voice whispered, gibbered and laughed in her ear as she ran, unable to stop her mad plunge through the Everfree. It was a sequence of events that she found all too familiar. And, as horrible as this was, what was coming was even worse. She wanted the running to end, but she didn't want to arrive at her destination. But, soon enough, she broke through. The dread forest faded, and she found herself standing on a field of dry grey stone, crazed, cracked and crumbling as it extended as far as she could see. The forest was gone, now. The only thing in sight was a small metal hut, built out of prefabricated pieces. The windows were blackened, and the single door loomed ahead of her. Beneath her bloody hooves, an enormous thing rolled and surged under the stone. But the thing that was down there was no threat, struggling in its death throes. What was behind that door was far worse. Though she was once again able to control her body, she refused to move. Instead, she stared at the door, dread suffocating her as her heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't look away. If she did, she'd somehow find herself closer to the door. And, if it came in reach, she might open it and reveal what was on the other side. The part of her that knew she was dreaming knew that this was the time when she typically heard the step of a hoof beside her, and tonight was no exception. Erin didn't turn her head, instead keeping the shed pinned down with her gaze. Hello, Pinky, Erin said. Wrong pony, a familiar voice said. Howdy, Erin, Applejack. Erin gaped at the other pony for a moment before panic set in. She'd taken her eyes off of the door. She turned back, a mewling sound of distress escaping her throat when she saw that it was only a few feet away, now. How? Why? What are you doing here? Laughter weren't working, Applejack replied. Maybe it's time to give honesty a chance. What's in there? Erin kept her eyes nailed to the door. I don't know. Applejack sighed next to her and Erin felt shame at the lie. Is it really so bad? Applejack asked, her voice kind. What's on the other side of that door, I mean? Erin grimaced, not replying. Lying to Applejack wasn't an option. Anything she said now would just trap her further. Why not just open it and get it over with? Applejack prompted. I can't, Erin whispered back. Why not? Can't be worse than having to go through this over and over again. Ain't you getting tired of it? Erin's throat worked as she swallowed back a sob. Applejack sighed again. Look at ya, you're standing there, shivering with fear. You keep ending up here, and it makes ya miserable. Why not open the door? At least that'll be something different. Her mouth worked soundlessly for a moment, then Erin said, I know I can handle this. I just have to hold on, and I can get through. I can just keep the door shut, and I'll be okay. But, if I open it? A long silence stretched between the two of them. Then Applejack said, if you open it, you don't know how things'll change. Erin nodded wordlessly, not taking her eyes off of the door. And, that's a scary thing, Applejack continued. Even if you're miserable now, at least it's a miserable you can deal with. So, instead of confronting what's hurting ya, you keep it locked up behind that door. Her eyes felt hot. Misery, shame and guilt, and anger, and fear. She wanted nothing more than to run away from all of it. Running away won't fix this, and you know it, Applejack said. It's all inside of ya. Resentment sparked. That's not fair, Erin said. Being fair ain't the same as honest, Applejack replied. Open the door. It can't be worse than this. And if it is? Erin asked, voice trembling. Well, ain't that what you got friends for? To help you when things get bad. She looked away from the door and into Applejack's bright green eyes, seeing herself reflected back in them. Erin was a mess, her mane tangled and her red-rimmed eyes haunted. She nodded. The door to the shed was right in front of her when she turned back to face it, and she nearly decided to run away again. But Applejack was still by her side, and she could somehow feel the presence of her other friends too. She reached out a shaking hoof and pushed the door open. The interior of the shed was all shadowed darkness, and shapes she only recognized because she'd been here once before, when she was awake. There was a table, surrounded by cheap metal folding chairs. Along the right wall were fold-out cots, currently unoccupied. Directly in front of her was a pony, far larger than her. It was dark green, mostly, except for where its fur and hide had been stripped clean by the Black Tide's nanomachines and healed a bright pink by the elements of harmony. Its limbs ended in stumps that twitched and jerked aimlessly. A pathetic stubble of black mane ran up its neck and along the top of its head. Erin drew in a deep, hitching breath, then slowly let it out. The sound of hoofsteps told her that Applejack had come up beside her. What do I do now? Erin asked, her voice trembling. Applejack didn't reply at first, instead leaning against Erin's shoulder, offering support. I think that's what you gotta figure out. Erin stared at the miserable wretch on the floor in front of her. Okay, she said eventually. She stepped forward, trying to come up with something to say. A dozen ways to start flashed through her mind, only to be discarded. Finally, she just said what she felt. I didn't want this, she said to the thing on the floor. She almost stopped, then, but something goaded her on. A part of me was hoping you would die. I hated you for what you did to me. I think I still do. No, I know I do. You hurt me. You controlled me. I was completely helpless. And terrified. And I was scared of you, and I hate you for that. But I didn't want this. The mutilated form of Malachite shifted on the floor and rolled his eyes, not looking at her. The stump of his left foreleg rubbed along the floor, and Aaron shivered at the sound of it. You saved my world. Or, at least, you helped to do so. A part of me wants to be grateful, but then this happened. Everything is all mixed up in my head, now. And I hate you for that, too, because it still hurts me. Erin stared at him for a while, writhing on the floor in her dream. He was a sad, broken creature. She closed her eyes as tears began to fall. I'll never forget what you did, and I'm not going to say it's okay, but I forgive you, not for your sake, but for mine. So I can stop hating, so I can stop being afraid. So I can maybe stop coming to this damned place. What was left of Malachite had stopped moving sometime during Erin's speech. She opened her eyes and frowned at the shadows where he'd lain, seeing that the space was empty. Malachite was gone. He'd been gone for a while. Erin drew in a shuddering breath, held it, then let it go. How ya feelin'? Applejack asked. She thought about it for a long moment. Better, she said. Better than I felt in a while. You were right, I should have done that ages ago. She looked at her friend and smiled. Should we get going? Applejack shook her head. One person left you gotta forgive, Erin, the farm pony said in a voice that brooked no argument. Who's that? Applejack didn't reply, simply staring back at her with a sad little smile on her face. Once again, Erin saw herself reflected in those green eyes. There's nothing to forgive, Erin said, then let out a shaky laugh. I couldn't have stopped it. It's not my fault I was too weak. Too weak to stop it happening. She trailed off, her mouth moving as the words got stuck in her throat. Applejack came up and pressed her chest into Erin's, bringing one foreleg up into a hug across her withers. The tears started up again, her eyes burning with them. Why? Erin asked. Why do I hate myself so much for that? I know it wasn't my fault. It was the override, I couldn't have stopped it. So, why? Logically, you shouldn't blame yourself at all, Applejack said softly in her ear. Nothing you could have done, but does this feel like a logical situation? That was enough to break the dam. Erin collapsed against her friend's shoulders as racking sobs tore their way out of her. She finally let herself fall apart, leaning against Applejack's strength as it all drained out of her. A part of her felt shame at her lack of control, and a clamoring voice in her head was urgently trying to tell her to get a hold of herself, to stop making a scene, to not make a mess all over Applejack's shoulder, but she couldn't stop. Instead, she simply clung to her friend as she would a life preserver during a storm at sea. It was true. As stupid as she knew it was, there was a part of her that felt like she should have been able to stop Malachite. If she'd been smart enough, or strong enough, she could have done it. Erin knew it wasn't true, but the feeling had never quite gone away. There was a part of her that truly believed that she could have willed herself back into control of a body that was designed to be controlled remotely. The bout of crying went on for a long time, slowly working its way down to a case of the sniffles. Erin drew her head back, casting a guilty glance at Applejack's coat, where the evidence of her weakness remained in the matted and damp orange coat. Don't you worry about that none, you hear? Applejack said sternly. A little mess ain't gonna come between good friends. We just gotta help each other through the bad parts, is all. Applejack smiled and held Erin's head in both forepaws. But maybe that's a discussion for another day. I don't think we're out of the woods yet, but I reckon we covered more than enough ground tonight. I'm downright proud of ya. Erin felt the heat rise in her cheeks as she looked away. I didn't do much of anything. Her self-effacement was rewarded with a rap of a hoof on her forehead, just under the horn. None of that, now, Applejack said, voice stern. It's been a long time coming, but you finally started working through the bad stuff tonight. Erin smiled over at her friend, just for a moment before the world seemed to spin around her. Then she frowned. This is all a dream, she realized. Applejack nodded. Yup, you. Are you really Applejack? Her friend tilted her hat down over her face, obscuring her eyes, but her mouth twitched up in that familiar, mischievous half-smile that Applejack sometimes wore when she was pulling a fast one. A discussion for another day, Applejack said. Besides, you've got to wake up, now. Ain't that your alarm? Erin's eyes shot open and she glanced around to see her tablet screen lit up as it beeped away on the nightstand next to her. With a sigh, she shut it off. Then she rolled onto her back, being careful not to crush her wings. Come to Equestria and have weird dreams, Erin muttered. They should put that on the travel brochures. She yawned and stretched all four of her legs straight out above her. It was almost too early, but she knew Jerry and the others would be here soon. Lucas and his crew had almost finished installing the solar tiles, and Jerry was nearly completed with the electrical upgrades. When he was done, Erin's house would not only have a battery backup for electricity, but it would also be able to use power from both the tiles and from Ponyville's somewhat spotty electrical grid. Then there was the Wi-Fi equipment, which was nearly complete as well, and installed in a small closet that Erin didn't plan on using. There was a diagram printed out and taped to the inside of the closet door that listed what each piece of equipment was, and how to maintain it. For the most part, that seemed to mostly boil down to, if it doesn't work, unplug it for a few seconds, and then plug it back in. As usual, Erin opted not to shower right away. Her morning was going to be spent at Sweet Apple Acres getting dirty, tired and sweaty, after all. Instead, she ran a brush through her mane and tail a few times to get the worst of the snarls out before trotting off, leaving her door unlocked so Jerry, Lucas and the others could get in if needed. Erin trotted briskly towards the Apples farm, looking forward to the Big Apple family breakfast in store for her. Twilight**. Twilight settled her saddlebags across her back, giving the apartment one last look just to make absolutely sure that she hadn't left anything behind. She even opened each and every drawer and cupboard in the place, even though she knew she hadn't used any of them. Triple check the room before we leave, she said. Check. Check, Spike repeated, making a mark on the checklist. All right, I think we can. A sharp knock on the door interrupted Twilight mid-sentence. I wonder who that could be. Opening the door revealed a slightly sweaty guard, the sunburst medallion on his barding indicating that he was a member of Celestia's personal solar guard. Miss Twilight Sparkle, the guard intoned formally. Princess Celestia would like to request the pleasure of your company in the autumn yellow tea room. If you'll kindly accompany me. I know the way, she said as she grabbed Spike in her telekinetic aura and plopped him on her back. Hold on, Spike, okay. Spike's panicked response was almost instantaneous. Wait, twee. One flash of magic, a jerking sensation and a feeling of being firmly squeezed for a few seconds, and she appeared with a bang in the autumn yellow tea room. It was a space Twilight was fairly familiar with. Princess Celestia only seemed to come to this particular room when there was a lot going on. She had once told Twilight that it was her special sanctuary. Light, Spike finished, then groaned as he slid off of her back. Ugh, I hate teleporting. Princess Celestia was already there, alone, drinking tea out of a chipped porcelain cup. Typically, no servants were allowed in this room except to clean up. She looked up with a single arched brow that turned into a smile when she saw who had just intruded on her tea time. Sorry, Spike, Twilight said as the little dragon staggered over to a nearby cushion and flopped down on his back. It was true, teleporting could be extremely disorienting if you weren't used to it. She felt fine, herself. All of her recent practice meant that she barely felt a twinge after teleporting. Princess, you wanted to see me. Welcome, Twilight. Yes, I did. And, while I'm very pleased to see your progress with teleporting, I would have been perfectly happy to wait until you had a chance to walk here. Twilight looked down and scuffed a hoof along the floor. Sorry, Princess. I thought it might be urgent. Urgent. I'm uncertain of that. Very definitely important, however. You can count on me, Princess. Twilight said staunchly. How is Erin doing? Princess Celestia asked. Adjusting well to life in Ponyville. Twilight exchanged a look with Spike, who shrugged and rolled over, closing his eyes. She considered the question for a moment. Last I checked, yes. She was starting to study magic. I gave her a beginner's guide. I know she wants to learn flying, too. I'm not sure how much she's managed to learn, though, since I've been in Canterlot for the last week or so. Has she mentioned anything about a prisoner? Specifically, freeing a prisoner of stone, or two becoming free and breaking, or anything about mountains, I suppose? No, Princess, Twilight said, then added slowly, though, the prisoner sounds familiar. I think I read that in a book. The princess regarded her for a long moment, as if deciding what to say. Twilight shifted nervously from hoof to hoof, her ears flicking. I had a bad dream last night, Celestia said finally. Twilight blinked, drawing her head back. Oh, I see. This was no ordinary dream, Celestia continued, her face drawn and tight. I think it was a vision, of sorts. A warning of things to come. A tired smile crept across her face. I have those, sometimes. I see, Twilight said. The first inklings of excitement were making themselves known. Was Celestia going to ask her to interpret her dream? Was it going to be part of some prophecy? How exciting. But wait, what if she got it wrong, and Equestria was doomed because she wasn't any good at dream interpretation? Come to think of it, Twilight realized that she had started reading a book on dream interpretations a few days ago, but put it aside when she'd realized that it had nothing to do with entering the dream realms. What if the information she'd needed was in that book? And now, Equestria was going to be doomed because Twilight couldn't have been bothered to finish it. And, worse, the princess was going to set her a task that she would fail. Twilight snapped herself back to attention. The panic didn't go away, but it did fade. Yes, Princess. I'll tell you as much as I can remember. I'd like your honest impression. Okay, Twilight said. And please, try to relax. Have a seat, perhaps have some tea. You look far too tense. Okay. Twilight marched over and sat stiffly on a cushion. She took in a deep breath and then let it out, making a pushing motion with her hoof as she did so. Cadence had taught her that trick. She'd said it was to push away the stress. It worked, at least a little bit. Twilight felt her muscles relaxing slightly, and she even managed to direct a tiny smile Celestia's way. At least, until Spike's unexpected snore ripped through the room. Twilight burst into uncontrollable laughter, causing the little dragon to sit up with a grumble and move to a different corner of the room. Celestia smiled fondly at the dragon before looking back to Twilight. All right, then, my dream. One moment, please, Princess, Twilight said. Her horn lit up, and she pulled a scroll, quill and ink out of her saddlebags. I think it would be a good idea to write this down, so I don't forget any details. The princess' smile turned merry for a moment. Since when have you ever forgotten a detail? The smile was infectious, and Twilight felt herself returning it. The relaxed attitude prompted Twilight to be a little daring in response. There's a first time for everything, she quipped. Celestia chuckled in response, then took a sip of her tea as her eyes took on a faraway cast. Then she started speaking. In my dream, I awoke in my bedroom with a terrible sense of some impending disaster. Twilight listened intently while she wrote the details of Celestia's dream, barely letting herself think about the implications of what was happening. This was Princess Celestia, relating one of her dreams to her. What other pony could claim to be privy to such a thing? Well, besides Luna, Twilight realized. It wasn't a very long dream, and Celestia waited patiently while Twilight reread what she'd written down. Prisoner in stone, Twilight said. I know I've read. Her eyes widened and she bolted to her hooves, horn glowing. Wait, I know. A loud snap of magic and displaced air preceded the familiar sense of pressure and momentary disorientation. Lucky for her, the princess had been right when she'd mentioned that nobody else had taken over her old room at Celestia's school for gifted unicorns, or Twilight could have found herself in an incredibly awkward social situation as she suddenly popped into some pony else's living quarters. It didn't take her long to find the book she was looking for, laying where she'd left it right before being sent to Ponyville for the first time. There was another crack of displaced air as Twilight teleported back to the autumn yellow tea room. The glow of magic from the teleport had barely faded, and Twilight already had the book open, flipping pages magically as she scanned the different entries. Here we go. Predictions and Prophecies, page 311. Twilight quickly read the passage, her eager smile replaced by a worried frown as the words sunk in. The prisoner of stone stands alone in the garden of the sun and must be freed before the two becomes free and Canterlot falls. Chaos tamed by the heart of kindness, taught the true meaning of friendship or harmony shall never be restored. The meaning of at least part of it was pretty clear. Twilight felt a sinking sensation in the pit of her stomach, which at least distracted her from the baffling capitalization of apparently random words in the passage. Twilight, what does it say? Twilight shook herself and passed the book over to Celestia. Oh, dear, Celestia said. I've just realized who the prisoner in stone is. In retrospect, it seems obvious. Twilight nodded. Discord, though, how he is supposed to help prevent a disaster is beyond me. What concerns me more is the part about chaos tamed by the heart of kindness. That can't mean Fluttershy, can it? Princess Celestia stared at a point above Twilight's head for a few seconds. That may make a certain amount of sense. Twilight blinked and pawed nervously at the carpet. No offense, Princess, but I can't see Fluttershy willing to be anywhere near a creature like Discord. He was awful. But not as awful as he could have been, Celestia replied. The princess' voice was unusually subdued, her eyes distant. Discord hadn't been as bad as he could have been. Twilight shivered at the thought. What do you mean? It's something I noticed when he was free last time. Luna and I had planned on keeping him distracted while you searched for the elements. I can't tell you how worried I was when he simply ignored us. Celestia shuddered, her feathers ruffling as a pained grimace crossed her features. And then came confusion. What Discord did to you and your friends was terrible, but it was nowhere near as bad as what he's truly capable of. Celestia frowned as she looked down at the prophecy. I have to wonder if he was changed at all by exposure to the elements. And if a second exposure changed him even further. It's hard to imagine him being worse, Twilight said, her skin crawling with revulsion. Princess, what Discord did to me lingered for weeks, and I know I'm not the only one who had nightmares about it. I understand, Twilight, and, yet, he was still less malevolent than he'd been centuries earlier. Princess Celestia got to her hooves. It's something to consider and discuss with my sister. I promise you this, though, if Fluttershy refuses, I won't push it on her. But what will happen then? A wry smile appeared on Celestia's face. Well, in that case, we'll just have to face whatever future this prophecy predicts without the help of the mad spirit of chaos. The building that housed the Manhattan University of the Arcane Sciences actually predated the founding of the city itself by several centuries. The oldest part of the university was also the smallest, distinct from the rest due to the large blocks of rough grey stone used in its construction, still marked black in places by the countless torches that had burned in wall sconces through the centuries, now replaced by smokeless magical lanterns. Newer additions to the facility typically didn't bother matching the earlier ones, meaning that students studying the history of architecture could get quite the education just from wandering the grounds. Archmage Silverwell Starfall was just beginning his relaxation routine in his private study when sharp knocks sounded from the heavy oaken door to his apartments. Grumbling, he levitated his thick half-moon glasses back onto his muzzle, set aside his ancient teacup and forced himself up and off of his threadbare red couch. His knees and hocks creaked in protest as he picked his way through the cluttered rooms, reaching his front door just as another 3 knocks sounded. Yes, he snapped as he flung open the door with a burst of magic. 3 young ponies stood there, the one in front with his hoof raised as if to knock again. What do you want? It's after hours. We were hoping we could ask you some questions, Professor Starfall, the one in the center said. May we come in? Professor Silverwell scowled at the 3 unicorns before him, a mare and 2 stallions. One of the stallions was larger than the other, and it was this one who had spoken. The mare next to him had a smile that was rather unsettling. A word tried to suggest itself to the Archmage, but was gone before he could grasp it. Something starting with the letter P, he decided, then shrugged it off. The 3rd stallion was much smaller than the others, standing in the shadows as if he belonged there, his face expressionless. I don't entertain students after hours. I've always been very clear on that, Silverwell snapped, drawing his neck up managing to look down his muzzle at the mare and stallion, in spite of them being taller than him by a head. Get a tutor if you need help with your coursework. It's not about classes, the larger male said. Please, Professor, it's urgent that we speak to you. There's something of critical importance going on that we think you need to know about. May we come in? The professor chewed peevishly on his scraggly moustache for a moment, then grunted. Fine, but watch that you don't knock anything over. He turned and walked back into his apartment, hearing the students walk through the doorway behind him. As the first crossed the threshold, Silverwell hesitated briefly before smiling. Predatory, that was the word he'd been looking for to describe the mare's smile. Professor Silverwell chuckled and shook his head. His memory wasn't what it used to be. One moment, he said as he turned and faced the 3, I'm going to clear up some of this clutter right quick. He ignored the grumbles from the mare as he lit his horn. His sitting room was indeed a mess, with books and scrolls covering nearly every flat surface that wasn't already occupied by an empty teacup in a saucer. Books were levitated into the nearby hallway, where they were stacked neatly. Scrolls were gathered up and placed inside his old roll-top desk, which was then levitated into the same hallway as his books. Levitating that many objects at once was tricky, especially when he was keeping an eye on his 3 guests rather than on what he was moving, but he wasn't an archmage for nothing. After the books and scrolls were moved to safety, the furniture was moved to the far wall, clustered together so as to take as little space as possible. He was just dropping the last of his many end tables on top of his couch when the male student spoke again. Very interesting cleaning job, Professor, he said. But where can we sit if your furniture is all piled up like that? Archmage Silverwell snorted and turned to face the 3 of them. The mare was scowling petulantly, while the larger stallion simply looked nervous. The smaller stallion was standing in the doorway, his eyes half-lidded as he looked around the room. Some of that furniture is centuries old, he said, contempt coloring his voice. I moved it out of the way so it won't be damaged, as I expect a fight after I refuse to offer hospitality to a group of changelings. The mare gasped, and the larger stallion startled, drawing his head back and laying his ears flat. Then he smiled slowly, his horn glowing as he used his magic to shut the thick oak door behind him. Interesting. What gave us away? Wards on my doorway to tell me exactly who it is visiting me, the Archmage replied. I'm no fool, and you've bitten off more than you can chew with me. I'll allow you to surrender now, if you like. The mare goggled at him blankly before breaking out in laughter. Oh, he's funny, she said in a lilting voice. Can we keep him? Silverwell stomped a forehoof and activated the spells he'd inscribed in the air between them while he'd been rearranging his furniture. Fortunately, these changelings either didn't know or had neglected to cast the spell required to see another pony's spell workings, which allowed him to take them by surprise. A shield sprung up around him as the first circle lashed out, banishing the changeling's pony forms. A much more complicated array comprised of several interlinked circles all spinning together activated to create a zone of anti-magic around the three of them, denying them the chance to strike back. Still more circles, these inscribed on the floor beneath his unwanted guests, magnified gravity tenfold. The two changelings hit the floor with a solid thud, him with a pained grunt and her with a shrill cry of distress. How amused are you now, dear? Professor Silverwell said, then cackled. I'm finding this pretty funny, myself. He regarded the two of them closely. If I'm not mistaken, what I have here is a rare changeling general, and an even more rare changeling nymph. Am I correct? The general managed to pull his head up off of the floor, his neck trembling with the effort. He grinned and gasped out, you missed one. Silverwell took a step back, his eyes shooting towards the third changeling. A shocked gasp tore its way out of his muzzle at what he saw. The small changeling was not only standing and still in its pony form, but its horn was glowing a sickly green. It was casting, somehow, in spite of the anti-magic field that should have been covering it. How? Professor Silverwell's own horn lit up as he cast a quick spell to show any enchantments or castings in the area. What he saw filled his veins with ice water. The small changeling was casting the most incredible, most complex array of interlocked spell circles that the Archmage had ever seen in his life, making the room look as if it were inside of a giant clock. Many of the runes and connections were completely alien to him, twisting to form eye-blurring patterns in the air. It formed a hemisphere that rose to the ceiling, encompassing the entire room. The Archmage looked up with a sinking feeling as he realized that he was standing right in the center of it. Initiating capture, the changeling said in a dull monotone. The array collapsed inward, shattering his shield and smothering both the Archmage's own magical constructs along with his cry of distress. He collapsed onto the dusty rug on his floor, wrapped in the changeling's strange magic. Panic welled in his chest as he tried desperately to teleport, or to shield himself. The changeling nymph's hoof came down right in front of his muzzle, and he rolled his eyes up to her sneering countenance. Yes, she said, I'm still finding this funny. There was a burst of green light, and then the changeling general stepped up next to the nymph. He was wearing the Archmage's own form as he grinned down at him. The nymph disguised herself once again, then lifted Professor Silverwell up with her magic. One moment, Princess, the general said, his horn lighting up. Silverwell felt his thick glasses rising off of his muzzle. I'll be needing these. Is that everything? The nymph asked. Should be, the general replied in Professor Silverwell's voice. Good, the nymph said. Then, to the small changeling, take us home, infiltrator. The third changeling's horn glowed green, and a section of the air twisted, resolving itself into a rectangle the size of a large doorway with what looked like a dark cavern on the other side. Come along, then, the nymph said primly as she trotted through the gateway hanging in the air while ignoring his muffled protests. We have accommodations ready and waiting, just for you. The infiltrator followed them, then lit its horn again. The magical doorway in the professor's sitting area untwisted and the cavern disappeared. The changeling general looked around at what was now his apartments, at least for the moment. Some quick levitation work moved the couch, chairs and tables back to their original locations, or at least close enough that Noppany was likely to notice. The new Professor Silverwell made his way to the study and relaxed on the old, threadbare red couch. He looked around, then spotted something that made him smile. Horn glowing, he raised the ancient teacup to his lips and took a sip. Author's notes. Hopefully, all these dream sequences and prophecies aren't too jarring. I had originally planned on introducing them more gradually, but now I'm trying to pick up the pace of the story. We sometimes have fun in the comments during the editing pre-reading part of this. Brilliant Point picked this out as his favorite bit. Again, shenanigans ensue during editing. Don't you worry about that none, you hear? Applejack said sternly. A little mess ain't gonna come between good friends. And sometimes friendship is messy. BP, gar, bad brain. Velocity mad, gar, x2 hoopy McGee, guys. Greater than underscore less than, change this from, and sometimes friendship is messy. We just gotta help each other through the bad parts, is all. Chapter 18, Journey. Tilde asterisk Luna asterisk tilde. Luna gave a guilty start at the sound of hoofsteps outside of the royal sister's private dining hall. The piles of paper strategically placed around her breakfast of strawberry-smothered waffles erupted from the table as she began to frantically gather them up in her magic, arranging them into a single untidy stack. She just managed to get them all together just as the door opened, though she realized with a sinking sensation that there was no reasonable place for her to hide them all. Princess Celestia stood in the doorway, looking down at her younger sister with a small and disapproving frown on her muzzle. The young Prince Verdant was nestled between Celestia's folded wings, curled into a ball and breathing the steady, deep breaths of the soundly asleep. Luna. I thought we had agreed that there was to be no more working during breakfast. Perhaps it was Luna's guilty conscience that caused her to flinch at the disappointed tone in her sister's voice. Ah, yes. Well, you see, you weren't here yet, and I have a simply ridiculous amount of correspondence to get through before day court begins. Celestia settled into the cushions directly across from Luna. Her horn glowed, lifting the young prince off of her back and settling him into his own cushions next to her, which he nuzzled down into with a grumble and a sigh without waking. I understand, Celestia said. She broke into a wry smile. Believe me, I do. She frowned at the large and irregular stack of paper. No two leaves were the same size or weight, and their colors ranged from plain white to creamy beige, along with the occasional red, blue or pink mixed in with the rest. What is all of that? And why not let the administrative staff handle most of it? Luna scowled as she set the papers back down on the table. Because these letters are mostly from noble families with enough influence to insist upon getting my personal attention. Half of them are calling upon me to step down from my position, half are complaints about my competency, half are blatant attempts to curry favor through base flattery, and the rest are none too subtle hints of how our lines should be joined in matrimony at the first opportunity. Celestia chuckled. By my count, that is at least 3 halves, sister. Yes. There may be some overlap. Celestia gave an introspective hum. She began assembling her own breakfast. Well, the flattery isn't unexpected. Nor are the complaints, sadly. I received quite a few of those of my own over the centuries. The marriage proposals are a bit surprising, though. I haven't seen any of those in, oh, I would say 500 years, I think. Luna let out an annoyed harumph. For the most part, none of them actually get around to proposing. They contain a wealth of implication without ever reaching an actual point. Possibly they are afraid of offending you, Celestia said as she spread some raspberry preserves on a slice of toast. Perhaps, came Luna's sour reply. After a moment, she chuckled. I did receive one overt proposal, though. It was really quite sweet. Where is it, now? Her horn lit, shuffling the papers before her, before she found one that was made of thick, light blue construction paper. Here, read this. Celestia took the letter in her own magic, clearing her throat before she began reading. Dear Princess Luna, she read. I think you are very pretty and also very nice and I would like to marry you when I get older. My mom said it was okay. Signed by a young gentle colt named Burnished Copper, age 6. Luna was trying to smother her giggles behind her hoof. She was failing. I don't believe I've ever seen a marriage proposal written in crayon, before, Celestia said. She turned the paper around. Ah, there seems to be a drawing of you together on the back, also in crayon. He seems quite the handsome young fellow, though apparently lacking his back left leg. Luna giggle snorted, which caused her sister looked up at her sharply. Now, Luna. You must treat this proposal with all the dignity and respect that this young gentle colt is due, Celestia said, her solemn voice betrayed somewhat by the quirking at the corners of her mouth. The young lad has given you perhaps the most heartfelt proposal any princess has ever received. How are you planning to answer? Ah, well. I must let him down gently, of course, Luna said with a mock regretful sigh. The age difference is simply too great. I plan on keeping the letter, though. It's just too sweet to discard, which is more than I can say for the rest of these proposals. She gestured at the remaining stack with a waffle-laden fork. Those I plan to use as firelighters. Celestia chuckled. I think that's for the best. Any other news? I thought there was to be no more business at the breakfast table. You broke the rule first, dear sister, came the smug reply. And, I admit, I'm curious how things are going, now that I'm no longer at the forefront of the day court. Luna considered that while she chewed and swallowed a bite of her waffles. Well, we finally gotten Maggie Henson to begin building our own harmonics facility here in Canterlot. Oh, yes. I'd heard about that. We'll require several of the harmonics staff to stay here for a number of years, in order to teach us how to use them, Luna said. Though, I'm hoping to get some of the archmages out to study the process. Celestia quirked an eyebrow. To what end? To improve upon it, of course, Luna replied with a self-satisfied grin. Her sister was fantastic at maintaining the status quo, but not so much with innovation. Perhaps we can find a way to go between worlds without violently tearing holes in the very fabric of reality, which could allow us to have more gates open, and to keep them open permanently. Perhaps we can even discover a way to replicate the harmonics process with magic, rather than technology. Ah, I see. Celestia nodded thoughtfully. That would be extremely beneficial. Luna sighed and slumped. Unfortunately, I'm getting nothing but polite refusals or vague promises of future support from the Arcanum. None of the Archmagi I've reached out to seem willing to make the effort to even meet with me, and I'm unwilling to make it a royal summons. None of them. Celestia drew her head back. That's surprising, and disappointing. Indeed, came Luna's glum reply. A moment of silence stretched between the two sisters, punctuated by the sounds of silverware on crockery and the gentle snores of Prince Verdant. It was Celestia who broke the silence, speaking with uncharacteristic reluctance. Staff. Could you leave us, please? The attending palace staff, stationed along the walls, exchanged startled glances with one another before bowing and walking out. What was all that about? Luna asked when the last of the servers had shut the door behind them. Celestia didn't answer at first. Instead, she was casting what Luna recognized as anti-scrying and privacy spells. Very powerful ones, at that. A band of tension tightened around her chest as Luna realized what her sister wanted to discuss. Have you considered the matter of my vision any further? I have, sister, Luna said, keeping her face carefully neutral. Have you? You know what discord is like. I remember, Celestia replied calmly. Indeed. Luna could feel her heart pounding faster. Surely, thou dost remember what he did to the townsponies of Bryville. She grimaced at her slip back into Old Aquish and took a deep breath before continuing. All those damnable paths of wonder. I remember those, yes, Celestia said, still with that insufferable calm. I also remember the singing forest, the mirror pool, the unending joy parade and all the rest of the so-called 999 amusements. Luna shuddered. At least the elements restored those things to normal after Discord's first banishment. We can only hope so. The way Discord twisted the landscape before the elements restored them, there's no way of telling for certain. Celestia frowned. And I know some of his creations survived. Oh. Luna raised an eyebrow. That's the first I've heard of it. Most of them ended up in the Badlands, though I had heard reports that there was a small nest of owlbears discovered in the Griffin Kingdom a century ago, and Twilight and her friends have recently encountered both Poison Joke and a cockatrice in the Everfree Forest. The latter created because Discord wanted a menagerie of animal statues for his garden without taking the trouble to make them himself, Luna pointed out harshly. This is the creature you wish to release. He was different this time, Celestia replied calmly, though she kept her eyes averted. Different. It sounded like a feeble defense to Luna's ears. In what way? He was far less cruel. More playful. Celestia's calm veneer finally gave way to a pained grimace. Still unbelievably dangerous, of course. But he could have stopped Twilight and her friends at any time, in any number of ways. Instead, he played games with them. Luna's eyes narrowed. I remember Discord's games, sister. Do you? This was nothing like back then, Celestia replied, having managed to recover that serene expression that Luna was finding almost infuriating at the moment. Only a slight ruffling of her ivory feathers hinted at the tension she must be feeling. I think the elements could have affected him, somehow. Luna scoffed. So you've said before. I believe it to be true, though, and I keep coming back to one thing that supports my argument. And that is Nightmare Moon. Luna's blood ran cold. How could her sister bring up what had been Luna's darkest time in Discord's defense? And so casually, as if it were nothing. She drew herself up, her posture stiff and inflexible. Would you care to explain your meaning, sister? The nightmare moon of 1,000 years ago was powerful, driven and cruel. She would stop at nothing to achieve her goals. This is true, Luna said, glaring into her sister's serene face. And yet, Twilight and her friends still live. Why is that? That? Luna stopped, her mouth open. She considered the question for a long moment. I don't know, she confessed. Perhaps the long banishment weakened the nightmare's power. Not one bit, I assure you, Celestia said with a shamed grimace. Without the elements, I was overwhelmed almost immediately when she returned. And yet, like Discord, Nightmare Moon chose not to eliminate the most obvious threat to her existence. Why? A growl rose up in the back of Luna's throat. Why don't you tell me? She snapped. I believe the elements softened her, for a lack of a better term. Some small modicum of compassion, perhaps even part of the element of kindness itself, took root in her heart. She simply wasn't as ruthless as she had been back then. I couldn't say. Luna scowled down at the table. She took a deep, shuddering breath and tried to calm herself. I was still trapped in the nightmare at the time, barely aware of what was going on. Yes, well, unfortunately, we have no way of proving if my hypothesis is correct, short of waking Discord. Celestia's folded wings bobbed as she shrugged. It's difficult to judge the effects when there's nobody else still around who has been struck by the elements. Luna's shoulders hunched as she turned her face away from her sister. There's me, she said bitterly. No. Celestia's voice was firm, her expression earnest. The nightmare wasn't you, Luna. Born from you, but it wasn't you. An upswell of gratitude helped to stave off the inevitable shame that always rose when Luna contemplated Nightmare Moon. She pushed the emotions aside to focus on the conversation at Oof. There was one other, Luna pointed out. Your former student. Celestia looked confused for a moment before she flinched and looked down at the small green colt still sleeping next to her. No, Malachite is gone. Besides, even if the elements had an impact, it would be difficult to tell if those transferred to Verdant. Luna chewed the inside of her lip for a moment, then took another forkful of waffle, barely even tasting it. All right, Celestia, I agree to freeing Discord, as insane as that sounds. Luna pushed her plate away. I have conditions, though, and those are. The very moment he does something untoward, he's back in the garden where he belongs, Luna said. And spellwork, the most powerful we can weave, to limit where he can go and what he can do. If he is able to twist Twilight and her friends again, or even just hide one of the elements, then we will never be able to stop him. Agreed, Celestia replied with a nod. I've already researched a few spells that I believe will do the trick. Though, I would greatly appreciate it if you would go over what I developed so far. Luna sighed, rubbing a hoof at her temple while wondering what it was she'd gotten herself into. Very well, after breakfast. Celestia's warm smile answered her. After breakfast. Riddle tilde. Changelings didn't typically have the opportunity to feel many different emotions of their own. Fear was common enough, as was the occasional flare-up of anger. The most common was boredom, felt by those waiting at the hive for orders. Love was only ever felt as it came in from their prey. Currently, Riddle was feeling an emotion that she had never felt before. Before today, she'd only ever observed the biting and barbed emotion known as jealousy from a distance. Now it was streaming out of the changeling herself, tainting the air a sickly yellow with streaks of bitter crimson. Why Raka had decided it was necessary to bring spectral charm to their sessions, she couldn't even begin to fathom. You don't seem happy, Raka said. A small wisp of concern emanated from the human, which Riddle gratefully absorbed. I don't know what you mean, Riddle said evenly. I'm perfectly fine. Raka frowned. Is it because I decided to start calling you by female pronouns? Calling you an it didn't feel right, but I could go back to that, if you prefer. No. Riddle blurted. She blinked, surprised at her own reaction. No, I told you, I was probably going to go with female, if I ever had the chance. It's fine, I like it. She smiled at Raka. I really do, thank you. I think it's me, Spectral Charm said. His voice was flat as he glared at her through his ridiculous glasses. I don't think she likes me. Riddle felt a moment of panic. Could the unicorn sense what she felt? She'd always been told that ponies couldn't sense emotions, but what if that were wrong? What if there were a spell of some sort that gave them the ability? Jealousy and Riddle's fresh panic weren't the only emotions in the room, though they were by far the most prevalent. There was still that tendril of affection coming from Raka, which was enough to keep Riddle fed. But there was another link, a thicker one, that went between both Spectral Charm and Raka. The two were friends. Spectral Charm cared for Raka, and Raka cared for the unicorn in return. Riddle ground her teeth in frustration. She's mine, you insufferable creep. Raka was looking at her. Riddle forced her face to stillness before adding a shy smile. I don't know him. I'm a little uncomfortable, is all. She ducked her head and allowed her gossamer wings to droop. Sorry. It was important for Riddle to keep herself under control. Being imprisoned by the humans was bad enough, but now her one steady source of love energy was threatened. Raka had told her that she was leading the scientific team to Harmony in just 5 more days. Raka seemed to accept that, smiling and giving her an affectionate rub between the ears. Any worries about the volunteers? There were plenty of concerns, but Riddle hesitated to voice them. 7 humans had volunteered to try interacting with her, to see if they could provide enough love energy to sustain Riddle's cognitive functions. Of those, only 5 managed even the smallest amount. I think there will be enough energy with the 5 of them, Riddle replied carefully. Barring unforeseen circumstances, Raka sighed. I'll ask for more volunteers, she said. I'd prefer to be certain, before I go. The human hesitated. If we can't find enough love energy, I suppose I might have to stay behind. The cascade of emotions that filled the room at that statement was the reason why she hadn't tried harder to convince Raka to stay. When Riddle had first hinted that even 5 volunteers wouldn't be enough, the answering resentment from the human had briefly flooded the room. It was a reflexive emotion, and one that Raka had smothered quickly, but it had shaken the changeling badly. It had been blindingly obvious to Riddle that the human was fixated on the expedition to Harmony to the extent that she would subconsciously begin to hate anything that stopped her from going. If she was going to lose Raka as an energy source either way, she preferred it to be temporary. Raka would come back to her eventually. Riddle stood and put on a determined expression. Raka, no, she said, making her voice firm. I know how much this means to you. I couldn't live with myself if you gave up on your dream. Oh, spare me, Spectral Charm said, and this time Riddle couldn't help but shoot him a glare. Unfortunately, he'd been too busy rolling his eyes to notice. Maybe she had laid that on a little thickly. Still, Raka's stream of affection strengthened considerably for a few seconds, which allayed Riddle's momentary worry. Spectral, be nice, Raka said, grinning down at the unicorn. Riddle needs our help if she's going to be allowed to stay here. That didn't sound good. Allowed to stay, what do you mean? I'm trying to convince my superiors that we need to keep you here, in this facility, Raka said, looking down at the thin-fingered hands clasped in her lap. They want to move you to a secure facility, and I can't have that. There's no guarantee that they could find anyone there who would care about you, and you would die. Riddle didn't bother to hide the shudder that swept down her spine. You should be grateful that Raka is so tenacious when she wants something, Spectral Charm said, staring down his muzzle at her. It took her a couple of days, but she managed to convince me to help. An insufferable smirk flashed across the unicorn's face. Fortunately for you, I arrived at a solution fairly quickly. It's your ability to metabolize affection and process it into magic that is the key to your survival. If my theory is correct, you should be able to generate magical energy, which makes you completely unique here on Earth. And, since Project Harmonix has the only magical research department on Earth with employees who can actually use magic, that means you'd pretty much have to stay here, Raka finished with a huge grin. You want to feed me love so that I can generate magic? Riddle cocked her head, blinking up at the unicorn. I'm not sure what use that would be. It's simple. Spectral Charm's horn glowed as he levitated what Riddle recognized as a magic storing talk out of a saddlebag. If you can convert affection into magical energy and push any excess into this device, then you have a very definite value to both human and pony kind. Riddle scuffed a hole-filled hoof across the concrete floor of her cell. I don't know. Raka has been wonderful, but it's not like I have an excess of affection. A proof of concept is all we'd need, Raka replied, picking up the talk and running her fingers over it. If that works, we'll push for even more volunteers so we can get you charging these on a regular basis when the gateway is down. It took a moment for Riddle to realize what had just been offered to her. If she could actually manage to charge a talk, she'd have value. If she had value, the humans would work to protect her and keep her alive. For the first time since her capture, a future that didn't involve an early and unpleasant death stretched out before her. Happiness and optimism. Two more rarely felt emotions that were now radiating out of the changeling. Perhaps some more sharing was in order, so as to keep the goodwill flowing. Being able to convert love energy into magical energy is vital to our ability to disguise ourselves, you know, Riddle said, attempting to be nonchalant. As expected, Raka glanced up from her examination of the talk, her eyes sparkling at the tidbit of new information. How so? Compared to ponies, common changelings are extremely weak, Riddle replied. Outside of illusion magic, my magic is pathetic compared to most unicorns. Basic, weak levitation barely better than a foal's. I can fly, but nowhere near as well as a Pegasus, and I can't normally affect the weather. And an earth pony's strength. Forget it. She shrugged and offered up a self-effacing grin. But we can use the love energy we harvest to increase our natural abilities, make ourselves more appealing. Say, if a Pegasus wants a mate who can fly as well as they do, or a unicorn wants someone with a strong magical ability. On our own, we can't do it, but we can use the energy of their own affection to bridge the gap. Spectral Charm seemed mildly disturbed by the idea, judging by the sour purple tang of disgust emanating from him. Raka, on the other hoof, was intrigued. Riddle could tell both by the emotions flooding the room as well as the way she leaned forward, a hungry look on her face. So, you can basically upgrade yourself to better suit your mates? Raka asked. Temporarily, yes. Riddle nodded. There are limits, depending on class. Common soldier, the various levels of officer, generals, princesses and the queen, we each have our upper limits. But, yes, generally speaking. She grinned. Changelings become whatever those who feed us need us to be. We don't even have to think about it, really. It's all automatic. If you love me enough, I could almost pass for a wonderbolt. Raka whistled and leaned back. Once again, Riddle was amazed by how easy it was to trigger a release of affection from the human. All she had to do was engage her scientific interest. Well, maybe we should stop wasting time and see if you can pass for a battery, Spectral Charm said, his voice flat. Riddle bared her fangs at him, hoping it would be taken as a grin. Seriously, his jugular was right there. Well, then, she said through her fake smile. Let's get started on that proof of concept, shall we? Twilight tilde. The sound of an explosion startled Twilight out of the light doze that the rocking of the train had lulled her into. She glared at Spike, who was sitting next to her and playing some silly little game on his tablet. From what she could see, it involved launching fruit at passing birds for some reason, which would then explode when hit. That wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was how the little dragon would break out into the occasional giggle when it happened. Spike, I think that's enough of that game, don't you? Twilight recognized the protruding lower lip and wide eyes of an incoming pout, and decided to head it off before it got any traction. Maybe you could watch a movie, instead. Spike brightened at the suggestion. I suppose I could, yeah. Just make sure it isn't so loud it disturbs the other passengers, Twilight said. Spike, already poking at the screen with his stylus, grunted in reply, and Twilight went back to looking out the window. Her trip to Canterlot had lasted much longer than she'd expected. Almost 2 full weeks, half of that time spent being frustrated in her attempts to learn dream magic. After her eventual success, there had been a few more lessons before Luna had declared that her training had progressed far enough for her to continue it from Ponyville. After all, her physical presence wasn't required if they'd be meeting every night in the dream realms. By the time the princess had made that decision, Twilight was more than happy to go. She wasn't sure, but it seemed like Trixie had been avoiding her ever since her first successful trip to the threshold. Whenever they did talk, the former showmare had been stiff and oddly formal, which put Twilight on edge. Twilight had no idea what she'd done to upset the other mare, but at least she wouldn't have to deal with her directly. Not outside of the dream realms, at least. The train pulled up to the Ponyville station some time before noon. Spike put his tablet away as Twilight retrieved their minimal luggage, and together they made their way back to the Golden Oaks Library. The swell of emotion at the sight of the tree library sometimes still felt odd to Twilight. Home, a couple of years ago, she never would have been able to credit it. Living in a small agrarian town with next to no research facilities. Not to mention moving so far away from the princess. A younger version of herself would have found the very thought absurd. Even the fact that her residence was a library wouldn't have been enough to convince past Twilight that she could live here. Today, she couldn't imagine living anywhere else, and the books were only a small part of that. Twilight opened the front door to the library, smiling like she always did when she caught the smell of the books, all properly in their shelves. More or less. A quick glance told Twilight that the temporary librarian, Mrs. Stacks, had been reshelving things again while Twilight was away. She wouldn't have minded if it weren't for the fact that the older mayor arranged every book alphabetically, with no regard to subject and in complete defiance of the duet decimal system. Not that she minded, of course. There were few things more relaxing and fun than reshelving day, and the silent battle of wills between the new and old librarians was actually something she looked forward to. She suspected that Mrs. Stacks did, as well. Spike slid off of her back and immediately charged the stairs with a quick, "See-ya." His little legs pounded up the steps, the noise bringing Mrs. Stacks out of a side room. The older mayor stopped, her eyes narrowing. "So," Mrs. Stacks said, "this is what counts as a few days." Twilight wilted under the glare and offered up a sheepish smile. "Sorry," she offered. "It took longer than I expected to get my hoof in the door with dream magic." That brought the elderly mayor up short. "Dream magic," she frowned. "Oh, yes, I remember there was an announcement for that. So, you went and joined Princess Luna's dream guard, then?" "Oh, no," Twilight said as she floated her saddlebags off of her back, placing them nearby with the rest of her luggage. "I just wanted to learn. Oh, and this is for you," she added, opening up a suitcase and removing a small, wrapped box from inside. "As a thank you for maintaining the library while I was gone." The gift had its hoped for disarming effect. Mrs. Stacks brought a hoof up to her chest as her eyes widened. "Oh, you didn't need to do that." "I wanted to," Twilight assured her. "It's really the least I could do after leaving you here for 2 weeks." "Oh, well. Thank you, dear," Mrs. Stacks replied with a smile. She took the box in her own magical field and opened it with a quick efficiency that impressed Twilight. She removed the contents and gasped. "Oh, it's lovely." Twilight relaxed a little, glad that her intuition had paid off. The few times she'd been allowed in Mrs. Stacks' house, she'd noticed that the other mayor had collected quite a few different crystal animals. The gift, a pair of crystal robins in flight, had looked like it would fit right in with her collection. Mrs. Stacks placed the robins gently back into their padded box. "Well," she said as she floated the box over to her own saddlebags, which were hanging on a peg by the door. "I suppose that we should go over the business of the last 2 weeks." With a smile, Twilight nodded. "That sounds like a good idea." Tilda. Twilight looked around at the first floor of the library with a pleased smile. For all her adherence to alphabetization as a method of sorting books, Mrs. Stacks never did less than an exemplary job keeping the library tidy. The woodwork practically glowed, and not a cobweb was in sight, which Twilight wasn't always able to claim when she was in charge. Spike was where she had expected him to be, lounging in his little basket at the foot of her bed while watching a movie on his tablet. There was the sound of an explosion, followed by Spike's juvenile giggling. Twilight scowled, wondering if she should take the thing away. Then she remembered her own tablet, which was sitting on her nightstand. With a smile, Twilight magically retrieved a stylus and tapped the screen. Her smile faded as she looked at the display. A large, colorful box, rounded at the corners, was dominating the screen. Erin's name was scrawled across the top of the box, in what would be the header area if this had been a letter. Inside the box were smaller boxes, each with a line or more of text in it, along with a date. After a moment of contemplation, Twilight realized that this must be the texting that her friend had described to her a few weeks ago. "Hi Twilight." The first text box read, "Guess what? Ponytail has Wi-Fi, now." This was followed by the Earth date and time of Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:12 p.m. There was a second box under the first that read, "Sorry, that should be Ponyville. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:12 p.m. A third box read, "Ponyville, dang it. Text-to-speech is great, but it has its limitations. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:14 p.m. So, each message gets its own little box within a bigger box. Twilight mused aloud. How tidy. What? Spike asked from his basket, raising his voice so he could be heard over the noise of the movie he was watching. "Oh, nothing. I just received a few messages from Erin." Spike grunted and turned back to his movie. Twilight lay down on her bed and scrolled through the rest of the messages. I keep trying to go on the internet. Old habits. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:32 p.m. Pinky says hi. No pony else seems to have noticed we're connected. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:34 p.m. Oh yeah. Kinda forgot you left your tablet in the library. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:37 p.m. and that you wouldn't be able to see this anyway, since the network doesn't reach Canterlot. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:37 p.m. Well, when you get back, we can communicate with this whenever we want. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:38 p.m. Not when we're sleeping, obviously. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:38 p.m. but whenever else. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:39 p.m. We should have lunch when you get back. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:42 p.m. Wherever you want. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:42 p.m. Even hey burgers. I know you love those. Friday, March 25, 2039, 5:45 p.m. This is so cool. Jerry just told me I have control over the drones left behind from Harmonix. Friday, March 25, 2039, 6 p.m. You know, those black flying things. Friday, March 25, 2039, 6:01 p.m. I guess they're using them for wireless repeaters, so the network can reach Fluttershy's and Applejack's houses. Friday, March 25, 2039, 6:05 p.m. I have an app to control them. It's really cool. Friday, March 25th, 2039, 6:06 p.m. I'll show you when we get together. Friday, March 25th, 2039, 6:08 p.m. Hey, are you back yet? Saturday, March 26th, 2039, 8:07 a.m. How about now? Saturday, March 26th, 2039, 9:30 a.m. When are you coming home? I want to show you this stuff. Saturday, March 26th, 2039, 11:15 a.m. Sorry if I'm pestering you. I've missed texting so much, I can't even tell you. Asterisk does a happy texting dance. Asterisk Saturday, March 26th, 2039, 11:30 a.m. Ugh. Looking at all this stuff I sent you, I look like some lunatic stalker or something. Saturday, March 26th, 2039, 11:33 a.m. Maybe I should go over and erase this off of your tablet before you get home. Saturday, March 26th, 2039, 11:44 a.m. Twilight glanced at the time on her tablet. It currently read 11:50, which meant that Erin had sent her last message just a short while ago. After some experimentation, Twilight was able to figure out where to tap in order for a small keyboard to pop up on the screen, allowing her to begin typing out her own reply. She'd barely begun when she heard the library's front door open, followed shortly thereafter by the sound of hooves quickly coming up the stairs. Twilight smiled just as her bedroom door opened, revealing a slightly frazzled-looking Erin, whose look of panic faded to one of dismay. "Hi, Erin," Twilight said sweetly. "Something I can help you with?" "Hey, Erin," Spike said from his basket. Erin's eyes flicked towards the tablet, then back up to Twilight. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then deflated with a sigh. Welcome back." "It's good to be back," Twilight said with a grin. "I'm surprised you knew I was here." "Oh, well. Though I shouldn't have been," Twilight continued. "I suppose if any pony would know where I was, it would be my lunatic stalker." Erin deflated a little more while blushing. A sheepish smile crept across her face. "You saw that, huh?" Twilight laughed, rolling out of her bed and leaving the tablet behind. She went over and gave Erin a hug, which was enthusiastically returned. "It's really good to see you," Twilight said. She released the hug and stood back. "And, I hate to ask, but are you busy right now?" "Not really. Why?" "Well, I was wondering if you could go round up the others for me. Celestia has something she wants us to do." Erin took a step back, her eyes widening. "Is there a problem?" "Not yet, no." Twilight sighed. "Something big is coming up, though." "What is it?" Twilight shook her head. "It's better if I tell every pony all at once. It's not an emergency, but it's fairly urgent. Would you mind?" "Not at all," Erin said, then smiled. "It's not like I have a job right now, or anything." After Erin left, Twilight sat down on her floor and stared at nothing for a few minutes. Of all the things Princess Celestia had asked her to do, attempting to perform the Spirit of Chaos would undoubtedly be the most difficult. For the first time in a long time, she had no idea how to proceed. She wasn't even sure if she should bother making a plan. Discord's mere presence defied planning, which was one of the more aggravating things about him. With a sigh, Twilight glanced up at the clock on her bedroom wall. Judging by prior experience, it would take at least an hour for every pony to gather at the library. Plenty of time to begin reshelving the library, which would at least keep her mind occupied. The thought cheered her up a little as she made her way downstairs. Within minutes, she was happily reorganizing shelf after shelf, troubles momentarily forgotten. Raka ***. The day had finally come. A fleet of semi-trucks were staged in the parking lot of the Harmonics compound, engines idling while waiting for the gateway to open. Of the trailers attached to the rigs, some were self-contained labs, others were dormitories, and a few were packed with the supplies they would need for the next few weeks. A mobile science base, all ready to go once the gateway opened. This same procedure had been pioneered for bulk shipments of goods to Zanabra, in order to assist in building humanity's first non-terrestrial city. Raka figured that it would work just as well to get the science team and all their equipment onto the world of Harmony. A pair of large emitters were bolted to one end of the parking lot. The 6-member security team would be the first to go through in their 2 rugged diesel-powered pickup trucks to make sure the landing zone was secure, and then the semi-trucks would go through. Finally, the research team of both human and equestrian scientists would walk through, once everything was clear. Raka was standing next to Maggie Henson, just outside of a large tent made of clear plastic. The Harmonics team was inside the tent, monitoring readings and preparing to open the gateway. According to the estimates, the opportunity to open the gateway was coming up very soon. A large LCD clock was posted on top of the temporary framework that the large size emitters were tied into. The number was currently counting down from 10 minutes. Nerves were wound tight amongst the science crew, and Raka was struggling to stay focused herself. There was something she needed to make absolutely certain of before she left. "So, you're sure Riddle will be fine?" she asked. "She said she would be," Maggie replied. "We got another 2 volunteers, so we're up to 7 now." She said that was finally getting enough to keep her going, with enough left over to charge some talks. "It figures that it would take 7 people to replace little old me, him." Raka shot a grin at her old friend. "Sounds about right." The grin faded as she turned serious. "Promise me you'll take care of her, okay?" Maggie groaned and rolled her eyes. "I promise. Just like I did 3 times yesterday, 4 times between breakfast and lunch, and then twice within the last hour. I won't let her starve, I promise." "It's not just starvation, though. We're basically talking about giving her a lobotomy if she doesn't get enough affection." Raka twisted her fingers together, biting her lip as she looked at minutes counting down on the digital clock above where the gateway would soon appear. "Maybe I should stay behind." "No." Maggie took her by both shoulders and turned her until they were face to face. "Just, no." If Riddle hadn't said she'd be fine, I would agree, but she said she would be. She considered for a moment. "Would it help if I asked for more volunteers, just to be sure?" "Sure, if you can find anyone else willing to go through daily brain scans for a little extra pay," Raka replied, rolling her eyes. "I'm amazed you got as many as you did, honestly." "I'll put the word out," Maggie said. "I wish I could try it out myself." Raka knew Maggie would have at least tried, but she, along with several other key members of Project Harmonics, were forbidden from going anywhere near Riddle. The reasoning was that it was still unknown if the changeling was somehow able to alter their minds in a way that even the best tests weren't able to catch. "It would be easier if they'd let her disguise herself as something cuddlier," Raka muttered. She hesitated for a moment, then sighed. Look, be careful around her, okay? I don't think she's been using magic on me, but she's still a manipulative little thing. I saw some of the video footage, Maggie said wryly. It didn't look like you'd noticed. Of course I noticed. I'm not dim. Raka stuck out her tongue, causing Maggie to chuckle. I don't even know if she's even aware that she's doing it half the time. It's a survival skill for them, after all. She looked up at the clock. There were less than 5 minutes remaining before the gateway would open. The volunteers were ready, fear and tension thick in the air while every eye was fixed on the display. Almost time, Raka said softly. Maggie put a comforting hand on her shoulder. You're going to be okay, right? Yup. Raka's grin seemed to have a life of its own. I can't wait. This is history in the making, and I'm going to be out in front of it. Just keep yourself safe. Maggie was playing with the pens in her lab coat's breast pocket, a sure sign of her anxiety to anyone who knew her. There's 3 weeks before we can open another portal. You'll be completely cut off once the gate closes. I know, Raka replied. She'd never have admitted it, even to Maggie, but that thought had kept her up most of the last 3 nights. We'll be safe, though, I promise. No civilization found, no large predators yet. We'll be fine. And we've got the bunker, she said with a gesture towards the vehicle in question. The vehicle in question was an ex-military mobile command vehicle, nicknamed the bunker by the security team. It was armored, bulky, ugly, and freshly painted a dark green. It was twice as wide and 50% longer than the trailers and, in a pinch, could hold the entire team, human and equestrian alike. Provided they didn't care much about comfort, that is. It had air filtration, oxygen candles, water filtration, emergency rations, a medical station and the bulk of the armory that the security team would be bringing along. Fairly conservative estimates showed that, with strict rationing of supplies, the team could survive for up to 3 weeks inside the bunker. The equestrian research team were at the far end of the lot, clustered together while talking quietly. With the way their ears flicked around while they kept an eye on the vehicles and the human technicians, the pony explorers were obviously on edge. Raka found herself vaguely wondering if it was some sort of herding instinct that brought them so close together, or if it was just a fear of the unknown. After a moment of consideration, she realized that there was no appreciable difference between the two in this situation and resolved to study the question further when she had a chance to speak with some of the pony scientists. Engines revved and chatter cut off as the countdown passed the 1-minute mark. With her heart hammering and her mouth suddenly dry, she wished that she'd thought to grab a bottle of water earlier. It looks like this is it, Maggie said softly next to her. I'd better go and make sure this all runs smoothly. Yeah. Take care, Raka. Maggie hugged her so fiercely that Raka briefly feared a rib would crack. You too, Mags. I'll see you when I get back. Maggie's smile trembled a little before she turned to walk inside the plastic command tent. The last few seconds counted down. When the clock hit 10 seconds, a klaxon sounded. Engines revved, and several of the trucks in the parking lot jerked as the drivers put them into gear. The clock hit 0, the klaxon ended, and the air shimmered between the bulky emitters. A high-pitched tone started, setting Raka's teeth on edge. The tone softened, and the shimmering air suddenly snapped into focus, revealing a pleasant-looking landscape on the other side. The landing zone looked like it was a fairly flat space on top of a hill, with only some strangely textured alien plants clinging the ground. One of the security team barked an order, and the 2 security vehicles darted through. After a few minutes, the all-clear was given, and the semi-trucks began rumbling through, starting with the bunker. Then it was the research team's turn. Raka hefted her heavy duffel bag up to her shoulder and glanced over at Maggie, who was looking back with concern etched deeply into her face. Raka offered her a saucy grin and a farewell wave before joining the rest of the research team. She walked quickly, making her way to the front of the pack. She wouldn't be the first human on Harmony, the security team had that honor, but she was damned if she wouldn't be the first scientist to walk on the alien world.